In April of 1990, a bleary-eyed detective stepped into a townhouse in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. The detective had been on call for days, and all he wanted to do was sleep, but now he'd been called in to investigate a double homicide. The detective opened the door to the basement and began walking down the steps. The overhead light cast shadows on the floor below, so he couldn't get a clear look at what he was walking into. But when the detective got to the bottom of the stairs, he suddenly felt wide awake. The scene in the basement was far more gruesome than he'd imagined. 2 dead bodies lay there on the floor. And there was one thing that jumped out at the detective immediately. On a cardboard box sitting between the bodies, a heart and the letter U was scrawled in blood. The detective had no idea if one of the victims had left the message or if this was a scene staged by a deranged killer. And it would take him 6 months to get the answer he was looking for and to discover what really happened in that basement. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please gift the follow button a homemade wind chime made out of raw hot dogs. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of April 7th, 1990, 25-year-old Nancy Langert looked at the cardboard boxes stacked up in the living room of her home in Winnetka, Illinois, trying to figure out what else she still had to pack. She and her husband Richard were moving at the end of the month, and Nancy could not wait. She was almost 3 months pregnant, and the new house had a lot more space, including a room for the baby's nursery. But as Nancy scanned the room, she realized there really wasn't much left for her to do. Other than the boxes, the only things in the room were a TV, a stereo, a card table, and some folding chairs. The truth was that even though she and Richard had been staying in this small townhouse for months that was owned actually by her parents, they had never actually really settled in. It always felt like it was a temporary place to sort their finances out, after Richard had racked up some serious gambling debt. As soon as the thought of Richard's gambling crossed her mind, Nancy shook her head and then called for her little dog, Pepsi. She heard his nails clicking across the floor, and she picked him up and scratched under his chin, trying to take her mind off of Richard's gambling and their money issues. But it was no use. It was all she could think about. Both Nancy and Richard had good jobs working at a growing coffee company, but Richard had always liked to bet on sports. And at some point, he had started spending more than he earned and began also borrowing money from friends to keep up with his gambling. It had all come to a head months earlier when Nancy and Richard fell behind on bills and had to move into this townhouse owned by Nancy's parents. And then Nancy's mother had to create a budget for them and put them on a weekly allowance, which was very embarrassing for both of them. But recently, things had gotten a lot better. They'd paid down their debt, built up their savings again, and now they were about to move out of this temporary home. In fact, at this very moment, Nancy even had $500 in cash in her purse to deposit into her bank account. Nancy gave Pepsi a kiss and put him down on the floor, and she reminded herself to stay positive. Richard was trying hard to curb his spending, and other than his gambling issue, he really was a great husband. And Richard and Nancy had both wanted a baby for so long, and now it was finally happening, and she knew Richard was going to be an amazing father. Feeling better, Nancy sat down on a folding chair and flipped on the TV. At around 6:30 p.m., the phone rang. It was Richard, telling Nancy he was leaving work, and he'd be home to pick her up in just a few minutes. They were celebrating Nancy's father's 60th birthday that night. They had an 8 p.m. dinner reservation, but they were picking up Nancy's parents and sister at her sister's place first. Nancy turned off the TV, picked up Pepsi, and took him upstairs to the bedroom so he wouldn't chew up any of the cardboard boxes while they were gone. After putting him inside, she shut the door gently, walked back downstairs, threw on a coat, and walked outside to Richard's car, shivering in the early spring chill. A few minutes later, Nancy's sister, Jean, opened the door to her apartment with a huge smile on her face. She led Nancy and Richard inside, and then she handed Nancy 2 beautifully wrapped presents that she'd brought back from a recent trip to Ireland. Nancy opened up the first gift and found a gorgeous Irish wool sweater inside. But the other present made Nancy feel like she might cry from happiness. It was a little onesie and booties for a newborn baby. Nancy thanked Jean repeatedly and gave her a big hug. She was so happy. At around 8 p.m., the group got to the restaurant, and Nancy was happily surprised to see that none of her parents' friends were meeting them there. The celebration would now just be with family. It wasn't that Nancy didn't like her parents' friends, though. Some of them had been around for so long that they actually felt like her own family. Like her dad's work friend, Nick Biro, and his wife Joan, who she had totally expected to be there. But then there was this guy, Victor, who was one of her father's closest friends, but he was also rumored to be in the mob. Nancy didn't mind Victor, but Richard could not stand him. So his absence from the party was a relief. As the food started to arrive to their table, Nancy suddenly didn't feel well. Her pregnancy was giving her really bad nausea, and the smell of pasta and steak just set it off. But she didn't want to ruin the night for everyone, so she tried to hide the fact that she really just wanted to go throw up. However, she could see her mom looking over at her with a raised eyebrow from across the table, and Nancy forced a smile back. She knew she was not convincing her mother that she was doing okay, but her mother just went back to her lasagna without saying anything, in fear she might embarrass her daughter. After dinner, Nancy and the rest of her family all piled back into Richard's car so he could drive everybody home. He dropped Nancy's sister Jean off first, and when she got out, Jean gave Nancy a big hug and told her she would see her tomorrow at church. Then Richard dropped off Nancy's parents. However, Nancy's mother paused before getting out of the car. She said she noticed at dinner that Nancy was feeling sick and asked if maybe Nancy and Richard wanted to spend the night there, at her house. For a second, Nancy did consider it. I mean, having your parents around if you're feeling sick is kind of like what everybody wants. But Richard was supposed to dog sit for a neighbor, and she wanted to sleep in her own bed, cuddled up with Pepsi, so she ultimately said, no thank you. Her parents then said goodnight, and then they walked into their house. On the drive back home, Richard and Nancy planned out the rest of their evening. Richard would walk the neighbor's dog, and then actually sleep over at the neighbor's house to keep the dog company. But first, Nancy and Richard would take their dog, Pepsi, for a walk together. They pulled up to their townhouse, and Richard walked around the car, opened up Nancy's door, and helped her outside. They smiled at each other, and he asked her how she was feeling, and Nancy said she still felt nauseous, but she was too happy about everything to let it bother her. Richard gave Nancy's shoulder a quick squeeze, and then they walked inside together. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Nancy's mother called her daughter to see if she was feeling any better. But Nancy didn't pick up, so her mom figured she must be sleeping in and hung up without leaving a message. She knew she would just see her daughter later at church anyway. However, when Nancy's mother got to church that day and took her seat in their regular pew, the bench beside her stayed empty for the entire service. Nancy's mom worried the entire time, so as soon as she got back home, she called her daughter again. And when Nancy still didn't answer, Nancy's father said he was going over to the townhouse to make sure everything was okay. Nancy's dad got to the townhouse just a few minutes later. He figured Nancy was just sick and sleeping, so he wasn't actually all that worried. He rang the bell, but nobody answered, so he took out his own key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The place felt oddly quiet, and no one responded when he called out. Then Nancy's dad saw his daughter's purse lying on the floor, surrounded by cash and credit cards, and so now he was worried. Suddenly, he heard a noise upstairs. It sounded like scratching on a door. So he ran out of the room, took the steps up 2 at a time, and then headed down the second-floor hallway to Nancy's bedroom, where the scratching sound was coming from. There, he opened up the door, and the little dog Pepsi came running out, and the stench of urine immediately hit Nancy's dad. Now he was really starting to panic. He knew his daughter would never lock her precious dog in a room long enough for the dog to have to urinate all over the ground. He turned and ran back downstairs, now screaming his daughter's name, but still he didn't get an answer. He knew there was only one place he hadn't checked yet, the basement. Nancy's father ran to the top of the basement stairs. The basement light was on, but all he could see when he looked downstairs were shadowy shapes below, which he assumed must be their moving boxes. But as he slowly walked down the stairs and the shapes came into view, he gasped. They weren't boxes. They were the bodies of his pregnant daughter and his son-in-law. They were both covered in blood. Nancy was still wearing her clothes from the night before, and her eyes were wide open. For a moment, Nancy's father simply froze, unable to process what he was seeing. Then he leapt down the remaining stairs to his daughter's side and grabbed her hand, but it was freezing cold. He sprinted back up the stairs and he dialed 911. Winnetka Police Sergeant Gene Calvados woke up to the sound of his wife's voice calling him from the other room. He blinked at his clock, which read 6:40 p.m. He'd worked overnight and hadn't gotten to bed until about midday, and now his wife was saying he had yet another phone call from headquarters. All Sergeant Calvados wanted was just to go back to sleep, but he forced himself to get up and go to the phone because this was his job. and as soon as he heard his lieutenant's voice in the phone, Calvados snapped wide awake. The lieutenant said there had been a double homicide, and Calvados needed to get to the scene right now. A few minutes later, Sergeant Calvados parked his car outside of Nancy and Richard's townhouse. Calvados had seen plenty of violent deaths in his life. Before he became a police officer, he had served in Vietnam, and he had watched other young men in his unit grow hardened to bloodshed and violence, but Calvados really never got used to it. In fact, Calvados could see the face of every dead person he'd ever seen as clearly as if they were still right in front of him. And now he braced himself for the faces he was about to see in that basement. Sergeant Calvados stepped out of his car, and he saw several officers speaking to Nancy's father outside the house. Calvados quickly introduced himself and then headed inside, where a forensics team was already combing through the townhouse. One of the forensics officers came over to Calvados. He said the double homicide had taken place in the basement, but before Calvados went downstairs, he wanted to show the detective 3 pieces of evidence they'd found on the first floor. The forensics officer pointed to the ground just a few feet away, and Calvados noticed Nancy's purse lying there with $500 in cash and several credit cards lying next to it. Calvados quickly noticed there was still a TV and a high-end stereo in the room, so it seemed unlikely that what they were dealing with here was a robbery gone bad. Then the forensics officer led Calvados towards a door that opened onto a small back patio. Calvados saw a perfectly cut square piece of glass, which had been removed from the door and placed on the floor inside. And the forensics officer pointed out something interesting. The door was still locked. So whoever cut the glass did not reach through the hole and unlock the door, which would have been easy. Instead, they literally climbed through the small hole in the door, which would have taken far more time and effort. Finally, the forensics officer took Calvados over to a small card table that was next to a moving box. The officer said it looked like someone had rifled through the box and put a single item from it on the table. Calvados leaned in, and a look of surprise came across his face. The item on the table was Nancy and Richard's marriage license. But the forensics officer said he didn't know yet if the person who broke in had put the license there or if maybe it just happened to be there already. Calvados thanked the officer, and then after taking a deep breath, he headed to the basement, hoping things would start to get a bit clearer down there. Calvados walked down the steps slowly, and as the scene came into view, he couldn't help but wince. Richard had been handcuffed and shot in the back of the head. It looked like he had probably died instantly. Nancy, though, was not handcuffed, and her death had clearly been slow. She was shot twice in her side and in her abdomen, and there was blood smeared all around her body, like she had crawled or rolled in the blood after being wounded, and her eyes were still open, frozen in her final moment. Calvados also saw an axe on the floor between Richard and Nancy, and he wondered how that figured into the crime if the killer had a gun. Had the couple tried to fight back with it? He didn't know. Then something else caught Sergeant Calvados' attention. On a moving box between the bodies, a small heart and the letter U were scrawled in blood. Calvados crouched down and saw blood on one of Nancy's fingertips, so he wondered if she had left this message or if the killer had staged it to look that way. Regardless of the answer, Calvados realized whoever killed Nancy and Richard had not acted in the heat of the moment. The handcuffs and the execution-style shooting of Richard proved that. And that execution-style shooting made Calvados wonder if the murders had been carried out by a professional hitman. The cut glass in the patio door could also support that theory because it suggested a very high level of planning. But Calvados stood there and just shook his head, like he was arguing with himself. Removing the glass in the door seemed like something a professional would do, but then why would the professional killer squeeze through the small hole in the door instead of just reaching in and unlocking the door? Also, Richard's murder seemed like a cold-blooded, very efficient assassination, whereas Nancy's murder seemed sloppy. She clearly lived long enough to roll or crawl through the blood on the floor, and she might have lived long enough to even write that message on the moving box. So in a way, Calvados felt like he was almost looking at 2 different crime scenes at once. One crime scene for Richard and one crime scene for Nancy. Calvados suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. It was one of the officers who'd been talking to Nancy's dad. The officer told Calvados he had very important information. Nancy had been pregnant. Calvados' heart sank. He knew the look on Nancy's face would stay with him for a very long time. Later that day, as officers met with Nancy and Richard's neighbors, the chief of police decided to form a task force to investigate the double murder. He said he would ask for help from detectives from surrounding suburbs, but he wanted Sergeant Calvados to lead the team. Calvados knew this was going to be the biggest challenge of his career. A double homicide of a young couple that was potentially carried out by a professional hitman was a whole different level of crime than he'd ever seen in Winnetka. The next day, Sergeant Calvados knocked on the door of Nancy's parents' house. Nancy's dad opened the door, and Calvados could tell from his puffy eyes that he'd been crying. As gently as he could, Calvados asked the father if he could get Nancy and Richard's wedding albums and address books, or anything that could help him identify all of their friends and acquaintances. Nancy's father just nodded, looking shell-shocked, and invited the sergeant to come inside while he looked. Calvados stepped inside and then sat down on the couch, and Nancy's mother came in. She also had a vacant stare on her face, almost like she literally couldn't process what had happened. Still, almost on autopilot, she politely offered him some coffee, which Calvados said no thank you to. Then, Calvados told her that he was the one leading this investigation, and he really needed her to think as hard as she could about all the people in her daughter's life. Did she know anyone who might want to hurt Nancy or Richard? But Nancy's mother shook her head and said no. And as Nancy's father came in with the things the sergeant had asked for, he also said the same thing. Nancy and Richard were wonderful people with a big supportive group of friends. The idea that either of them had enemies seemed kind of ridiculous. On Tuesday, April 10th, so 3 days after the murders, Nancy and Richard's bosses at the coffee company offered a $10,000 reward for information in the case, and also Nancy's parents matched it. And so tips about Nancy and Richard began to pour in. Phones at police headquarters rang constantly, and before long, the task force was totally inundated. And as Sergeant Calvados sifted through all this new information they were getting, a new and much more complicated picture of the murdered couple began to emerge. A few tipsters alerted the sergeant to Richard's gambling debts, and the fact that he very likely owed people money because of his gambling problem. This was a major red flag to Calvados, but the debts themselves actually seemed way too small to be worth killing two people over. However, the tips about Nancy were more promising. Apparently, she had had an affair for more than a year, and her former lover had left town for Georgia just 2 days after the murders. This, combined with the marriage contract left on the table at the crime scene, made Calvados wonder if the killings were retaliation from Nancy's ex-lover for breaking the affair off. Calvados sent detectives down to Georgia to speak with Nancy's former lover, but the man said the affair was far more emotional than physical. Nancy mostly just wanted someone to talk to because Richard was working 2 jobs and she was just kind of lonely. But when Richard got his full-time job at the coffee company, the couple had totally reconciled and they got back to normal. And so this ex-lover said at that point, he also had been ready to move on. And so even though the move to Georgia came so close to the murders, it had actually been planned out for weeks. Calvados wasn't quite prepared to rule this man out quite yet, but he was already finding this case very frustrating. Everything from the conflicting evidence at the crime scene where, one murder is well planned and the other seems sloppy, and, the glass, why did you climb through and not unlock it by reaching through, to the contradictory stories about the victims seemed to pull him in very different directions. Meanwhile, rumors of hitmen and criminal syndicates began flying all over town. There was a bike path that ran behind Nancy and Richard's house, leading basically all the way to Chicago, and residents became convinced that a Chicago mobster must have been the killer, and they must have used that path to travel in and out sight unseen. Calvados did not necessarily buy that, but he got a tip that a close friend of Nancy's father, a man named Victor, supposedly had ties to the mafia. So Calvados began digging. However, he struggled to find anything useful. At least on the surface, Victor looked like an upstanding businessman. So Calvados was not any closer to nailing down a primary suspect. Four days after the murders, a massive crowd of 800 people from the area gathered for Nancy and Richard's funeral. The community really came out in force, to the point where random local groups like the high school's Peace Alliance Club and the track team were waiting in these long lines after the service just to offer their condolences to Nancy and Richard's family. Their deaths really took a toll on this town. Sergeant Calvados and some other detectives also went to the funeral, but mostly just to look for anybody who seemed nervous or excited or maybe overly dramatic. But all they found was a large group of people trying desperately to understand how something this horrible could have happened. After the funeral, Calvados went back to the station. He was on his way to his office when a lieutenant stopped him to tell him that somebody was there to see him. The lieutenant took Calvados to a very nervous-looking couple who said they had a tip about Nancy's sister, Jean. Jean was a lawyer, and she was heavily involved in political issues in Ireland. At that time, Ireland was in the midst of a violent period known as the Troubles. The Troubles were clashes between Protestants and Catholics over control of Northern Ireland, and there were regular shootings, car bombings, murders, and kidnappings. And Jean was not neutral. She provided legal aid to members of the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, which was the Catholic organization blamed for many acts of violence. The couple also told Sergeant Calvados that Jean had received a threat that if she returned to Ireland, she would be injured or maybe even killed. But despite that threat, Jean had gone back to Ireland very recently, and when she had arrived home, she showed up with gifts for Nancy and the baby just 3 days before the murders. The sergeant listened quietly, but inside, he was practically jumping out of his skin. This was the best lead he'd gotten so far. Maybe, he thought, somebody was hired to kill Jean, but killed Nancy and her husband by mistake. Or maybe they killed Nancy on purpose just to hurt Jean. It was not unheard of during the Troubles for innocent family members to be targeted for political revenge. And so, after speaking to this couple, Calvados got on the phone and called Jean into the station. Later that day, Calvados sat down across a table in a small interview room with Jean, and he could tell right away she was completely unlike any suspect he'd ever questioned before. Jean was unusually confident for somebody who was about to be questioned by a homicide detective. She sat up perfectly straight and calmly looked Calvados right in the eyes, without fidgeting or tapping her fingers or shifting around in her seat. Calvados asked Jean some basic questions about her job, and she was quite helpful. But then, the sergeant mentioned the threat that had been made on her life because of her work in Ireland, and also this theory that maybe a hired killer took out Nancy either by mistake or for revenge. At this point, Jean's demeanor totally changed. She went from cool and collected to sharp and visibly angry. She said it was ridiculous to imagine a gunman could confuse Nancy for her. They looked nothing alike. And the idea that someone would kill Nancy to get back at Jean was even more outrageous. Jean insisted that her job in Ireland was mostly human rights work, and not worth killing her over, let alone her sister. Jean leaned forward and looked Calvados dead in the eyes and told him he was really stretching with that theory. Calvados was genuinely surprised. This was not what he was expecting, and he wasn't sure if Jean's reaction was fueled by righteous indignation at questions she truly considered unfair, or anxiety and guilt at the idea that she might have played a role in putting her sister at risk. But the sergeant pressed on, and he asked Jean for the names of every person she had visited the last time she was in Ireland, along with all of her work associates there. Jean turned red and yelled at the sergeant that none of this had anything to do with her sister's murder. She said Calvados was not getting anything from her, and then she stood up and stormed out of the interview room. Sergeant Calvados just sat there, both really surprised and really mad. This death threat on Jean was the first real lead they had, and he couldn't fully investigate it without the names from Jean. He had expected her to be grateful and to immediately offer up anything she knew to try to figure out who killed her sister. And so he just couldn't believe Jean was unwilling to help him, unless, of course, she was involved. Without any information from Jean about the death threat, Calvados was left chasing other possibilities that frankly just seemed increasingly unlikely. Both Richard and Nancy had worked for a coffee company that imported their beans from Colombia, which Calvados, and basically everybody knew, was a major importer of cocaine. He knew that drug cartels sometimes hid cocaine in coffee shipments. In fact, just 3 months before the murders, federal agents had seized 5 kilograms of cocaine in a coffee shipment from a different coffee company. So Calvados started poking around into the coffee company, looking for any ties to cartels. But the owners of the company seemed mostly puzzled by this, and they gave Calvados permission to inspect their next shipment, like they didn't care at all, look at whatever you want. And so Calvados did that, flagging the ship that had their coffee on it to U.S. Customs officers, who then met the vessel when it came into port. A giant crane lifted the container with their coffee out of the ship and onto the dock, and then Customs officer cracked it open. Then they began slicing through random bags of beans to see if their drug-sniffing German shepherds could pick up a scent. But, like Calvados had feared, they found nothing. The police began to feel like they were just grasping at straws, and so they decided they should just go back to the beginning and kind of start over. So they re-interviewed all the neighbors, and they got one tantalizing tip about a mysterious man walking around the neighborhood the night of the murders, but after looking into it, they discovered it was actually just a bored teenager who lived nearby. After that, they looked into whether Richard and Nancy had maybe taken a loan from mobsters to lease their new place, but when they looked at the couple's tax records, they saw they could easily afford the rent. And so, once again, one after another, all the tips and leads they were finding just went nowhere. Calvados still had suspicions that Jean's ties to the IRA got her sister killed, but without Jean's cooperation, he struggled to make any headway on that lead. So by the end of May, Sergeant Calvados was basically out of ideas as his big case rapidly went cold. Finally, on May 30th, so about a month after the murders, the police chief pulled Calvados into his office. From the look on Chief's face, Calvados knew the news was not good. But he could not have guessed what was coming next. The chief told him they were going to dismantle the task force. They had spent a whopping $1 million on this investigation so far and still had not come up with a serious single suspect. Calvados was shocked. This felt way too early to basically give up. But the chief wasn't done. In addition to dismantling the task force, he wanted Calvados back on the beat while another investigator stepped in and took a look at this case. The chief followed up and told Calvados that he was not taking him off the case completely, he just wanted a set of fresh eyes on it. But as Calvados nodded and turned to walk out of the office, it definitely felt like he had failed and he was being removed. Sergeant Calvados walked slowly towards his team to break the bad news, at the same time feeling totally sick and angry at the thought of patrolling the neighborhood again with everything in this case still completely up in the air. But a few days later, sure enough, Calvados was back in his blue uniform, driving a police cruiser around Winnetka. He figured his days as a detective were likely over. 6 months passed with no progress at all in the Langert case. Sergeant Calvados focused on working his beat, but at the same time, he just felt so distracted because all he felt was regret that he had not been able to find the killer. But then, on October 4th, Sergeant Calvados was home sleeping when his wife woke him up telling him that work was calling, just like she had done on the day of the murder. But this time, when he picked the phone up, his lieutenant was yelling excitedly that there had been a break in Nancy and Richard's case, and Calvados had to get down to the station right now. Calvados was so excited, he rushed out of bed, he jumped into his car, and he sped to the station. But when he got there, he found the supposed break was just a kid. And not a very tough-looking kid either. It was a skinny high school senior who had arrived at the station with his girlfriend for moral support, asking about the witness protection program. Calvados had to keep himself from rolling his eyes. He wondered what this kid could possibly know about a brutal double homicide. And at first, when the kid began talking, his story, predictably, sounded unbelievable. The kid said he somehow knew the killer, and the killer had supposedly confessed everything to him in unbelievable detail. But as he began walking Calvados and the other detectives through what he knew, Calvados realized this kid was telling the truth. The teenager knew details of the crime that had never been made public, like how many shots were fired and the fact that the marriage contract was on the table. But beyond individual details, the teenager's story explained all the strange contradictions that Calvados had struggled with since the beginning of the case. Richard was killed quickly and efficiently, but Nancy's murder was messy and slow. The killer had apparently brought a gun along, but someone had grabbed an axe that wasn't entirely clear, and then the killer had used glass-cutting tools to get inside, but then needlessly crawled through the tiny hole in the door instead of just reaching through and unlocking it. And so all these things definitely lined up with what Calvados had suspected. Calvados had never been able to figure out if the killer was a professional hitman or a sloppy amateur, but now, as the sergeant listened to this kid talk, it seemed like the killer might have been a little bit of both. After speaking to this kid and looking at all the evidence in the case and looking at all their interviews, here is a reconstruction of what police think happened on the night of Saturday, April 7th, 1990, when Nancy and Richard were murdered inside of their home. The killer arrived at Nancy and Richard's townhouse while the couple was out to dinner. The killer had been preparing for this moment for months. They approached the patio door from the path that ran behind the house. They didn't even bother trying the doorknob. Instead, they pulled out a glass cutter to remove a section of the sliding patio doors. And then once the cuts were made, they stuck some very sticky tape to the front of the glass piece and then pulled it out silently, just like they had been practicing. Then, once it was out, instead of reaching through and opening the door, the killer crawled into the house through the hole and then waited. But they had no idea how long it would be before Nancy and Richard came home, and as the minutes turned to hours, the killer began to get restless. And so they just started wandering around the house sort of aimlessly, rifling through random boxes that were sitting around. And it was there that the killer found Nancy and Richard's marriage contract. They began to read it, but it was mostly legal jargon, so they just placed it on the card table near the box they dug it out of. But the longer the killer waited for Nancy and Richard to come home, the more impatient they got, and the more nervous. And so they ultimately just turned on a light and then sat on a chair in the shadows with their gun on their lap. They had a hood pulled down low, but they thought the light shining from behind them would help hide their face even more. Then finally, sometime after 11 p.m., The killer heard voices, and then the key in the door. Nancy and Richard walked inside, but they were so caught up in their conversation, they didn't even notice the killer sitting there. But then the killer spoke and told them to be quiet and closed the door behind them. The killer could instantly see how startled Nancy and Richard were. The killer then raised their gun, and Nancy and Richard's surprise quickly turned to fear. The killer loved it. The killer demanded Nancy hand over her purse. She said she didn't have any money, but the killer demanded the purse again, and so Nancy threw it to the killer, and everything inside of it fell out onto the floor, including the stack of cash totaling $500. Nancy started stammering that she'd forgotten about the money, and Richard urged the killer to just please take the cash and go. She wasn't trying to lie to you. But the killer, who acted totally offended at the idea that they were hiding things from him, was not actually here for their money. They didn't care. The killer, still aiming their gun at Nancy and Richard, reached into their pocket to pull out handcuffs. But as they fished around in their pocket, they began to curse. In their excitement about this night, they'd only brought one pair of handcuffs, not the two they actually needed. But Richard was clearly the bigger threat. He was a tall, athletic guy, so the killer gave the cuffs to Nancy and told her to handcuff her husband. As Nancy handcuffed Richard's hands behind his back, she began to plead with the killer. "Please don't hurt us. I'm pregnant." Something about Nancy's plea hit the killer hard, and they could feel their hands begin to shake. Suddenly there was a noise upstairs, and the killer accidentally pulled the trigger, shooting a bullet into the baseboards. But the killer quickly realized that the noise was just the dog, closed in the upstairs bedroom, barking at something. Still, the killer felt like their plan was now quickly falling apart. Things were already going so wrong. The killer started to lose their nerve, and they thought about sparing Nancy and Richard. So the killer told the couple to go to the basement, and then once they were down there, the killer would lock the door and just leave. And so the killer directed Nancy and Richard to the basement stairs at gunpoint, and no one said a word. But as Nancy and Richard descended the stairs and then reached the bottom of the stairs, Nancy suddenly turned around and looked at the killer. And the killer knew from her surprised look on her face that she had seen the killer's face. The light was better down there, and the hood did not disguise the killer enough. The killer knew Nancy would be able to identify them. And so now the killer had a choice to make. Let them live and face the consequences, or follow through with the plan. But before the killer could decide, Richard made a desperate move. With all his strength, he snapped the cheap handcuffs, jumped at the killer, and smashed his own head against the killer's head. Almost instinctively, the killer just fired the gun, and it hit Richard right in the back of his head. Richard crumpled to the floor. Nancy rushed to his side, screaming, then looked back at the killer, whose gun was still raised. Nancy shouted, "Not again, no!" and covered her face as the killer took a shot at her. The killer turned and ran up the stairs, but as they got to the top, they looked back. Nancy was still alive and moving. The bullet had only hit her in the elbow. The killer knew at this point they had already come this far, they had to go back. So the killer raised their gun again and pulled the trigger one more time. The bullet hit Nancy and lodged in her pregnant stomach. She collapsed to the floor, and the killer turned and ran out of the basement. But after the killer left, Nancy was still alive. Barely. She tried to climb up the stairs, but it was a struggle. The coat she was wearing was quickly filling with blood, weighing her down. And so with an enormous effort, she managed to pull off her jacket, but as she looked up the stairs, she knew it was just too much. She would never get up there. So Nancy turned and dragged herself over to the basement shelves and grabbed the nearest thing she could reach, the axe. And then with the axe, she banged on the shelf, hoping that the noise would get somebody's attention, but nobody came to the rescue. And so with her last bit of strength, Nancy dropped the axe, dipped her finger in her own blood, dragged herself over to a moving box on the floor, and drew a heart and the letter U. She looked at Richard, hoping maybe there was a small chance he would live and see her final message. "I love you." And then Nancy took her final breath. When the police began investigating this case, they knew that some of the evidence suggested the killer was an amateur, but most of their leads pointed to a professional hitman, which is why Calvados and his team had been so interested in the mob and in drugs and the IRA. It was a mistake that allowed one person to escape any attention at all, because the killer was right there, hanging around the investigation in plain sight the entire time. He was one of the members of the High School Peace Alliance Club who came to the funeral. He was on the track team too, so he ran past the Langert's house almost every single day. The police had even questioned him, because he was also the teenage boy who had been seen in the neighborhood on the night of the murders, but had quickly been written off. But it turned out that kid, the 16-year-old named David Biro, was the killer. And he also happened to be the son of Nancy's family friends, Nick and Joan Biro, who Nancy had thought might be at her father's birthday party on the night that she was killed. It would turn out 16-year-old David had serious psychological issues, and he had become obsessed with becoming a hitman after seeing the 1980s movie, Bestseller, about a hitman who wanted to turn his story into a book. The idea of killing people excited David, and he had actually already tried to do it at least once before. Prior to the murders, David's parents had him committed to a psychiatric hospital after he tried to poison his own family. But after only 2 months, his parents had let him come home against the recommendation of his doctors. And once he was home, teenager David Biro chose to live out his hitman fantasy by killing Nancy and Richard. And his reason for targeting Nancy and Richard had nothing to do with their connections to his family. Instead, he chose them as his murder victims because their townhouse was conveniently located, and he also found them, quote, annoying. David might have gotten away with these murders, but as the months went by and the police never came for him, he got cocky, and he began to brag to a friend about what he had done. He even showed his friend the glass that he'd practiced his glass cutting on, and he also showed him the murder weapon. And David's friend pretty much immediately turned him in, because he was very worried David would kill again. And so, on October 5th, 1990, almost 6 months to the day after Nancy and Richard were gunned down, David was arrested. It was the day before Nancy's baby would have been due. David was sentenced to life in prison for killing Nancy, Richard, and their unborn child. Nancy's parents would move back into Nancy and Richard's townhouse shortly after the murders as a way to feel closer to Nancy and Richard. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Late one night in November of 1975, a man came home and parked his car at the end of his driveway, which looped around the back of his house. And after sitting in the seat for a minute, he turned his car off and then hopped outside into the cold night air. From there, he walked towards the side of his house where there was a path that led around to the front door. But before this man could reach his front door, he heard a voice call out to him from somewhere off to his right. The man stopped and stared into the darkness, wondering if he really had just heard a voice at all. But then, as he stared, this voice called his name again. Confused, the man walked to the fence at the edge of his property and looked over it to see who was there. Little did he know, he had just walked into a trap. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week. Once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the 5-star review button to come along for a ride with you in your personal private airplane. But once you're up at altitude, without saying anything, put on the only parachute on board the craft and then jump out. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. "32-year-old Morris Blankenbaker was a very happy man. The gymnasium at Wapato Intermediate School in Yakima County, Washington, echoed with the sound of young teenage boys practicing their wrestling moves on thick green mats. And Morris was right there with them, whistle on a cord around his neck, shouting directions and encouragement as he moved from one group of kids to another. As far back as he could remember, the thump of bodies hitting the mats and the rhythm of other youngsters in a tight line at the edge of the gym doing calisthenics had always been music to Morris's ears. It had been 14 years since Morris himself had graduated from high school 15 miles to the north, along with his armload of sports trophies, the title of Best Athlete of 1961, and a 4-year scholarship to play football in college. But even though he had not achieved his dream of becoming a professional football player, Morris had never for a second lost his love of sports, both playing them and coaching them. But on this particular day, Friday, November 21st, 1975, Morris's sense of happiness and satisfaction with his life went much deeper than normal. Because the last 2 years of Morris's life had taught the former Golden Boy of Yakima County that the really important things in life were the 2 things he had come so close to losing: his marriage to his high school sweetheart, Deanne, and the joy of living under the same roof with her and their 2 young children. Though no one, not even Deanne and definitely not Morris himself, could ever have predicted the chain of events that had temporarily led to his separation and divorce from Deanne. And while Morris knew the shockwaves from those events were still reverberating throughout his work and social circles, the last few days had brought both Morris and Deanne a very rare feeling of calm and peace. And as they both looked forward to Thanksgiving together, just 6 days away, Morris had to believe that all the turmoil of the last 2 years was finally ebbing out of their lives, and that going forward, he and Deanne would never again take each other for granted. The sudden ring of the school bell pulled Morris back to the present. With a quick glance at the clock on the wall, he raised the whistle around his neck up to his mouth, and he blew 2 sharp blasts to signal the end of the practice. A moment later, and the boys were hauling their mats back to the hooks on the walls at either end of the gym. Hearing their respectful, "Thanks, coach," goodbyes, as the teenagers filed past him on their way into the locker room to change, Morris remembered an earlier scene from his own adolescence, and he felt a stab of pain. He had been just a few years older than these kids when he had first met his own favorite coach, Talmadge Glenn Moore, back in Davis High School 16 years ago. Known to everyone in Yakima County by his nickname, Gabby, and known to all the boys he had coached in everything from wrestling to track to football as just Coach, Gabby was one of Yakima's local celebrities. Ever since getting his first job coaching at Washington Junior High School back in 1958, Gabby had quickly moved up the career ladder, and by 1969, he'd made a name for himself as one of the most outstanding wrestling coaches in the entire country. And in 1972, at the very height of his career, Gabby had coached the David High School wrestling team all the way to first place in the Washington State Championships. But instead of accepting any offers to coach at the collegiate level, Gabby and his wife had chosen to stay in Yakima, a small agricultural town separated from the much larger city of Seattle to the north by the beautiful Cascade Mountain Range. And it wasn't just Gabby's coaching talent that had made him so popular in Yakima. It was also his ability to motivate and mentor even the most disadvantaged young men who went on to find purpose and promise as members of Gabby's various sports teams. When Morris had returned to Yakima in 1969, he and his former coach had reconnected. As adults now, rather than coach and student, they had struck up a friendship that included going hunting together, as well as going whitewater rafting, boating, and spearfishing. For Morris especially, life had changed a lot since he had graduated from high school. Despite getting that 4-year college football scholarship, Morris wound up dropping out of Washington State University and joining the Marine Corps Reserves instead. That was also when Morris and his longtime sweetheart, Deanne, who had just graduated from high school in Yakima, got married and settled down in Tacoma, a city of 109,000, perched alongside the Puget Sound on the west coast, under the shadow of the huge snow-capped mountain called Mount Rainier. But by the time Morris was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps Reserves at the age of 27, and when Deanne was 24, the young couple was ready to move back to Yakima, where they would be closer to their families. And over the next 4 years, Morris would eventually finish his degree by studying part-time at a community college 35 miles away and while working several jobs until he landed the position he had now at Wapato Intermediate School. In the meantime, Deanne had found a good job with a local bank in Yakima, and they had 2 young children, a little boy and a little girl. And in all that time, from 1965, when Morris and Deanne had married in the Presbyterian Church in Yakima, Through the years they had spent in Tacoma and their move back here to Yakima and the birth of their 2 kids, Morris had always felt like their marriage was as close to perfection as anything he'd ever known. Both he and Deanne were children of divorce. Morris had been raised from the age of 2 by his single mother, who had carved out a modest living for herself and her beloved only child as a highly trained court reporter. Deanne had come from a much wealthier family, but her parents' divorce had left her with a deep longing to find permanence and stability in a family of her own. And in Morris, the strong and gentle man she had first laid eyes on when she was just 14, Deanne was sure she had found her life partner. And in Deanne, Morris knew he had found the one and only person he would ever love. But all that would change starting in December of 1973. That's when Gabby, Morris's good friend and the coach he had admired for so many years, asked to come live with Morris and Deanne and their 2 kids. Morris had been stunned when Gabby explained that his wife of 20 years had kicked him out of the family home. To Morris, his coach's marriage had also seemed perfect. Gabby and his wife had 3 happy kids, they were financially well off, and they both shared the same passion, sports. Also, Gabby was just a total straight arrow, a complete stickler for modeling the behavior that he expected of the young men he coached. No drinking, no smoking, no drugs, and no messing around with girls. When Morris asked his former coach what had gone wrong, Gabby said that, like a lot of couples, he and his wife had just sort of drifted apart. But Gabby was sure he could win his wife back and persuade her not to file for a divorce. He just needed a place to live for a few weeks so he could pull himself together and then launch his campaign to save his marriage. Morris had not hesitated. This was the man who had inspired Morris's own decision to become a coach and physical education instructor. This was the man who had helped Morris become one of the best football players Yakima County had ever seen. And, most importantly, this man was Morris's friend, and Gabby obviously needed Morris's help. But delivering that help had been harder than Morris expected. In the end, it had taken Morris almost a month to override Deanne's objections to this plan of Morris's former coach coming to live with them. While Gabby had been one of Morris's friends, Deanne hardly even knew the 41-year-old wrestling coach, and her life was already hard enough. Money was tight, she was juggling a job and taking care of the kids. The last thing Deanne wanted was yet another person in the house that she would need to feed and clean up after. But by January of 1974, Deanne had finally agreed. Now, as Morris walked out of Wapato Intermediate School into the chilly, cloudy November afternoon, he wished he had listened to Deanne and found some other way to help his old coach. Getting into his car in the school parking lot, Morris glanced again at his watch. Deanne was working at the bank until about 6 that evening, so Morris would have the afternoon with their kids before they all ate dinner together, and then Morris headed off to his second job as a bouncer at a local tavern in Yakima called the Lion's Share. There, from 8 p.m. until 2 a.m., Morris would check IDs so the bar wouldn't be serving any underage drinkers, and Morris would also just keep the peace. It had been years since he'd played college football, but at 5 foot 11 inches tall and weighing 210 pounds, Morris was not only still in great physical shape, but he also had a patient temperament and a knack for diffusing tense situations. Not that either of those qualities had been of any use to Morris back in January of 1974, when Gabby had arrived on their doorstep with his suitcases and his charming smile. It had only taken a couple of weeks for Morris to realize that his old coach was a very different man than the one who had preached such high standards of clean living and integrity to his students. It turned out Gabby had a very serious drinking problem. But at the same time that Morris realized his coach was headed at top speed down the road to full-blown alcoholism, Deanne's objections to Gabby's presence had strangely totally vanished. Gabby was good at holding the whiskey he had started drinking by the bottleful, secretly during the day, and not so secretly at night after Deanne had gone to bed. And Gabby soon charmed Deanne by the help he offered with the kids, the sympathetic ear he offered to Deanne as she told him about the stress of never having quite enough money, how quick he was to lend a hand with laundry and grocery shopping, and the way he looked at her. Deanne had met Morris when she was 14 and when he was 17, and they had been a couple since Deanne had turned 16. By the time Gabby, the legendary local celebrity, arrived on the scene, Deanne was 27, and most of the passion and all the romance had drained out of her marriage with Morris. And even if Morris did not seem to notice at all, it was crystal clear to Deanne that Gabby found her captivating and sexy. So when Gabby taught Deanne how to drive his late-model golden brown MG sports car, and their hands happened to touch as Gabby showed her how to use the stick shift, Deanne welcomed the thrill and sense of excitement she felt. It didn't take long for Gabby to forget any plans he had made to win back his wife of 20 years. Instead, he could hardly wait for his divorce to become final. And it took Deanne just 2.5 months of knowing Gabby to trade Morris's steadfast devotion and predictability for Gabby's promises of a beautiful house in the best part of town and a daring and exciting love life. So, just halfway through April, when the Yakima County apple orchards were starting to bloom, and just 10 weeks after Gabby had first arrived on the Blankenbaker's doorstep, Deanne left her husband of 9 years and moved in with his former coach and trusted friend, Gabby. Gabby had recently left the Blankenbaker residence and got a place of his own. Deanne took Morris's 2 young children with her to the new house, where Gabby's own 3 children were regular visitors. As Morris pulled his car into the driveway of his home at 210 North 6th Street, he remembered the total shock he had felt when Deanne had told him she was leaving. Morris had been so busy working and so focused on the ways in which his old coach seemed to be falling apart in front of his eyes that he had been completely blind to the betrayal that was taking place right under his nose. Unlike Deanne, Morris had discovered why Gabby's wife had kicked Gabby out in the first place. Gabby had apparently become totally obsessed with his wife, and that obsession drove him to become paranoid that she was being unfaithful. Fed up with Gabby's accusations and his increasingly controlling behavior, his wife had ended their relationship, kicked him out of the house, and started a new life on her own. Looking back, Morris wished he had told Deanne about that side of Gabby. But at the time, given his wife's initial objections to Gabby coming and staying with them, Morris had not wanted to pile on and make his old friend look even worse in Deanne's eyes. Even through his shock and hurt when Deanne told him about her affair with Gabby, Morris couldn't help but think that Deanne's decision to leave was so impulsive and sudden that maybe someday she would change her mind and come back to him. So instead of losing his temper and destroying whatever feelings he and Deanne had left for one another, Morris had dug deep into his soul and told his wife that no matter what happened, he loved her and he would always be there for her. But once Deanne and the children had gone, Morris was totally devastated. And when Deanne and Gabby had announced they were going to get married on September 14th, 1974, just 3 months after Deanne officially divorced Morris, and just 9 months after Gabby had first moved in with the Blankenbakers, Morris promptly packed up his stuff and moved to Hawaii. 4 months later, though, Morris was back in Yakima. He just couldn't stand to be that far away from his 2 kids and from his mother Olive, who had just been through an illness serious enough that she had wound up in the hospital. Once back in town, Morris began picking up the pieces of his life. That's when he bought the 4-bedroom house at North and 6th Street and rented out rooms to some of his friends to help pay for the mortgage. And in the meantime, Deanne's storybook romance with the man who was 14 years her senior had already begun to fall apart. Once Gabby and Deanne were living together, Gabby did not try to hide his drinking. And Deanne was horrified as her new husband knocked off an entire 5th of whiskey at least 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes locking Deanne out of the house and screaming accusations that she was seeing other men. After 3 separations from Gabby, the longest lasting 2 weeks, Deanne had had enough. And in July of 1975, 10 months after getting married to Gabby, Deanne was filing for her second divorce. And this time, when she left her dream home on the better side of Yakima, Deanne took her kids straight back to her ex-husband Morris and his much less glamorous wooden frame house on North and 6th that was separated by just a little alleyway from a hodgepodge assortment of apartments and 2 family homes. Even as Morris and Deanne made plans to remarry as soon as Deanne's divorce from Gabby was finalized, Deanne dropped Gabby's last name, trading more for Blankenbaker. As Morris let himself into the house he now shared again with Deanne and his 2 kids, he told himself that he should have known that his old coach, competitive to the bone, would not let Deanne go without a fight. But what neither Deanne nor Morris had expected was the intensity of Gabby's anger and jealousy when Deanne left him to go back to Morris. Just a week earlier, in mid-November, while Morris had been working at the Lion's Share, he'd received a terrified phone call from Deanne telling him that Gabby had let himself into their house through an unlocked door, and he was now at the door of the master bedroom where Deanne had been sleeping. Deanne had heard someone inside the house and had had just enough time to lock the bedroom door before Gabby arrived and started pounding on the door, begging Deanne to take him back and threatening to kick the door down. Morris had grabbed one of his good friends who was at the tavern, and the 2 of them jumped into Morris's car and they drove at high speed from the Lion's Share back to Morris's house. There, they found Gabby, completely drunk, staggering around the outside of the Blankenbaker home, pounding on the downstairs windows, waving a gun, and threatening to kill himself or Morris. The friend that Morris had brought with him from the Lion's Share, Joey Watkins, another former student of Coach Gabby's, expected a fight between these 2 men. He was also stunned at the change in his former coach, who had always lectured everyone about self-control and the importance of staying away from alcohol. But instead of busting Gabby in the mouth, Morris went up to his old coach and talked to him quietly, getting him to stow the gun, get back into his car, and go back to the apartment that Gabby now shared with his 16-year-old son, Mike. To Joey, Morris had just shrugged his shoulders and said, "I could have hit him, but he was my coach too. I just can't do it." There was also another bond between Morris and Coach Gabby. Morris had once saved his coach's life. On one of the river trips that Gabby and Morris used to take together, their boat had capsized and both men had been pulled underwater by a deep current. Morris made it to the surface, but Gabby had been caught underwater in a tangle of vines and roots near the Yakima riverbank. Always an excellent swimmer, Morris had managed to dive down and free Gabby's legs and bring his former coach safely back to land, where Gabby coughed up the water in his lungs that had come so close to killing him. This event was yet another reason why Gabby's later betrayal in starting an affair with Morris's wife had hurt Morris so deeply. But it had also given Morris a sense that on some level, he had assumed a kind of responsibility for this man, whose life was so obviously coming completely undone. And besides, not long after that night when Morris had confronted Gabby out in the yard, it seemed like Gabby had finally gotten the message and was leaving Morris and Deanne alone. Starting on November 18th, neither Morris nor Deanne had seen or heard from Gabby. And that was when Deanne and Morris had finally begun to feel that both the turmoil and the gossip around Deanne divorcing 2 different husbands in less than a year and a half was actually over. With that final thought, Morris turned his full attention back to his children. And by the time Deanne arrived home from work at around 6:30 on the evening of November 21st, the whole family was ready to go out for Friday night pizza at Shakey's restaurant before Morris headed off to his night shift at the Lion's Share. At 5 a.m. the next morning, November 22nd, Deanne suddenly woke up feeling totally alarmed. She realized even before her eyes had adjusted to the dark that Morris was not in bed next to her. Getting out of bed and pulling on her bathrobe, Deanne hustled down the stairs and stepped out onto the front porch of the house to see if her husband's car was outside. And it was. Morris always parked at the end of their driveway that sort of wrapped around the back of the house, and so Deanne had walked over to the far side of their front porch and looked back in that direction, and she saw his car. Wondering if her husband had just fallen asleep in his car after coming home very late from his shift at the Lion's Share, Deanne walked down the porch steps and took a left and walked around the house towards the back, where she peered inside of her husband's car, but Morris was not inside. Puzzled, Deanne retraced her steps back to the front of the house, and then after going inside, she put on her contact lenses and then began searching every room of the house for Morris. But after searching every room, it was clear Morris was not inside. So, grabbing the collar of the family dog, Deanne went back outside, and this time, after going down the front porch steps onto the front lawn, she turned right and walked around that side of the house to reach the backyard. This side of the house, which was the left side if you were facing the house from the street, butted up against an alleyway. This alleyway was only separated from the house's property by a flimsy, short chicken wire fence, a barrier that was more psychological than physical. Between that chicken wire fence and the side of the house was a narrow stretch of grass that ran from the front yard straight back to the backyard. So after Deanne turned the corner and started walking down that stretch of grass, she suddenly stopped, because there, on the ground, near the open gate that separated the front yard from the backyard, was the figure of a man lying face down on the grass. A moment later, two neighbors who were waiting on the curb outside their nearby apartments to catch their rides to go out duck hunting heard a woman's frantic screams from across the alley. "Morris! Morris! Oh my God, he's dead!" By 5:25 a.m., Yakima police and medical personnel had already started arriving at the scene, lining up out front of the house on 210 North and 6th Street. And even before Yakima's chief homicide detective, Robert Brimmer, arrived 15 minutes later, first responders already knew three things. One, the dead man laid out on the grass under the first thin layer of falling snow was Yakima's popular intermediate school coach, 32-year-old Morris Blankenbaker. Two, given the stiffness of the body, Morris must have been killed hours before Deanne had dialed 911. And three, the obvious cause of Morris's death was gunshot wounds. By the time Sergeant Brimmer pulled up, officers were already surrounding the Blankenbaker property with yellow crime scene tape, and Deanne was inside the house with her wide-eyed children crying hysterically. Using flashlights, police officers searched every inch of the south side of the house where Morris's body had been discovered, hoping that the flashlight beams might glint off the shiny metal of a shell casing buried in the 3 to 4 inch deep grass. They also searched the nearby alleyway and all the trash barrels in case the killer had thrown the murder weapon into one of them. But all police found at the crime scene was a mostly empty bottle of beer that Morris had probably been carrying in his hand when he got out of his car. By 8:30 a.m., Morris's body had been taken to the county morgue, where an autopsy would be performed at 7 p.m. that night, and Detective Brimmer and his investigators were at the Yakima police station and fanning out through the Blankenbaker's neighborhood, interviewing witnesses and putting together a list of possible suspects. In most murders, the victim's spouse is at the top of that list, but it didn't take detectives long to rule Deanne out as a suspect. There was no trace of gun residue on her hands or clothing. Morris did not have a life insurance policy that might have given Deanne a financial motive for murder. And as the whole town knew, Deanne had just recently reconciled with Morris, and the two were planning to remarry. But what Deanne did have for police was the name of the man she was certain had to be behind Morris's death. And that was Morris's one-time friend and mentor, Gabby Moore, the man Deanne herself had only recently divorced. Deanne wasted no time telling Detective Brimmer about the incident just the week before, when the coach had shown up with a gun one night when Morris was working at the tavern, and how Gabby had entered the Blankenbaker house and threatened to break down the door to her bedroom. Deanne also told them about the harassing phone calls Gabby had made to their house almost every day, and Gabby's attempts to get his children and Deanne's own sister to try to pressure and guilt-trip Deanne into going back to Gabby. But even after hearing these details about what sounded like Gabby's obsession with winning back Deanne, Detective Brimmer just could not believe that Gabby, who literally owed his life to Morris, would have just walked up to Morris and shot him in cold blood. But lacking any other obvious suspects and having no evidence from the crime scene that provided police with any other leads in the case, Detective Brimmer picked up the phone and called Gabby, asking him to come to the police station and bring along any firearms he owned. Coach Gabby did come to the police station that Saturday afternoon, but he brought along an attorney, and he had nothing he wanted to say to police, except to point out that he could not possibly have committed this murder since he had been in the hospital from November 18th until hours after Morris's body had been discovered. It would turn out that the peaceful interlude that Morris and Deanne had enjoyed for the last few days when Gabby had finally seemed ready to leave them alone, it was actually just the result of Gabby experiencing such stress-related high blood pressure that his doctor had ordered Gabby into the hospital for treatment and observation. And after interviewing hospital and nursing staff, and even checking the windows and doors of the hospital for any possible way that Gabby might have slipped out to commit the murder, investigators would confirm Gabby's alibi. Over the next 3 weeks, police worked every possible lead and motive in the homicide case. They investigated any arguments Morris may have had with customers at the Lion's Share, arguments he might have had with parents, with students, or other teachers at the middle school where Morris worked, and every single one of those avenues led nowhere. Meanwhile, now that Gabby was out of the hospital, he picked up right where he had left off, trying to win Deanne back. He called her almost every day. And any time one of Gabby's friends, or a student on one of his teams, or a fellow coach or teacher stopped by to visit, the coach seemed oblivious to Morris's murder. Instead, all he could talk about was how much he missed Deanne and how much he wanted and needed her back. By early December, Gabby's drinking had gotten so bad that even the efforts of his assistant coach to cover for Gabby's failure to show up for practices and even meets were just not enough. Despite the awards and acclaim that Gabby's outstanding talents as a coach and mentor had brought to Yakima County, and to so many young men who had Gabby to thank for college sports scholarships, Yakima school administrators informed Gabby that they would be ending his teaching contract at the end of that school year. But even this blow to Gabby's ego and his reputation hardly seemed to register, because there was something else now worrying Coach Gabby, and this time he didn't call his lawyer before talking to Detective Brimmer. According to Gabby, someone was now threatening his life. The coach told police that he had received a phone call from someone whose voice he didn't recognize, telling the coach, "I got Morris, and I'm gonna get you next." But despite these reports, and despite Gabby's airtight alibi for the time of Morris's murder, there was one detective who just couldn't shake the feeling that the coach had to have been involved in some way in Morris's murder, and that Gabby was now making up these threats to direct police attention away from himself. And that detective was Morris's best friend, Vern Henderson. Vern and Morris had gone to high school together, and they had both been Coach Gabby's protégés. But while Gabby had never made it into professional football, Vern had realized his dream of becoming a cop. And on the day that Morris had been found murdered, 32-year-old Vern Henderson had sworn to Morris's mother, Olive, that Vern would find her son's killer. So, in those weeks after his best friend's death, Detective Henderson had started casually chatting up some of Gabby's current and former team members, hoping that someone might have heard or seen something, anything, that might connect Gabby to Morris's murder. But then, at about 1 a.m. on December 25th, 1975, early Christmas morning, Yakima police received a 911 call that turned Detective Henderson's theory and Deanne's suspicions about Coach Gabby upside down. At about 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Coach Gabby's 16-year-old son, Mike, said goodbye to his father before leaving to join his girlfriend's family for a Christmas Eve dinner. Mike had done his best to cheer his father up that day, and even Gabby's first ex-wife had come over to the apartment Gabby and Mike shared to clean and vacuum and wash the stack of dirty dishes piling up in the sink. And later that evening, right through to 12:15 a.m., other people who cared about Gabby, his daughter, and the same doctor who had ordered Gabby into the hospital just a month ago, all called to check in and see how Gabby was managing over the holidays. Gabby, who was an expert at covering up just how much he was drinking, had told them he was doing okay and that he wasn't completely alone since he expected more members of his wrestling teams to come by and visit. It wasn't until 1 a.m. on Christmas Day, December 25th, when Mike and his girlfriend came back to Gabby's apartment, that anyone realized Gabby was anything but okay. The first sign of trouble was the fact that the back door into Gabby's kitchen was propped wide open, and when Mike walked through that door, he saw his father's body lying sprawled between the kitchen and living rooms. Gabby was face down and not moving. Despite the fact that there was a .22 caliber shell casing lying about 2 feet away from Gabby's body, there was no blood anywhere and no sign of a struggle. It wasn't until the medics who answered Mike's 911 call put Gabby's body onto a stretcher that they realized that Gabby had not died of a heart attack or other natural causes. because as soon as they had turned Gabby over, blood began pouring out of a bullet hole just under his left armpit. An autopsy would later reveal that a small caliber bullet that matched the shell casing found near Gabby's body, as well as the bullets that had killed Morris Blankenbaker 1 month earlier, had entered somewhere under Coach's shoulder, ricocheted off of his fourth rib, and torn across the inside of his chest, ripping through his heart and both lungs. By the time the medics arrived, 6 pints of blood had collected in Gabby's chest cavity, and as soon as his body was moved, that blood, more than half of all the blood in Gabby's body, started draining out, quickly soaking the small throw rug under the coach's chest. Suddenly, Detective Brimmer and Fern Henderson realized that Gabby's reports that he was being threatened had likely been true. On the day after Christmas, Yakima residents woke up to yet another shocking front-page headline. Quote, "Tied to Blankenbaker slaying, Davis wrestling coach shot, killed." End quote. Meanwhile, detectives Brimmer and Henderson didn't need reporters to tell them that the murders of the city's 2 coaches, both recently married to the same woman and both shot with the same .22 caliber handgun, had to be related. And the first person they wanted to talk to was Deanne. Even if Deanne did not kill Morris, maybe she was so convinced that Gabby had a hand in that murder that she shot Gabby out of hatred and revenge. They also wondered if maybe Deanne had yet a third admirer, another person so obsessed with wanting her that they would kill both Morris and Gabby. But within 48 hours, detectives were back to square one. Not only did Deanne deny any involvement in Gabby's murder and the existence of some third mystery lover, she had an airtight alibi for the time of Gabby's murder. She and her children had spent all of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day with family. And as far as anyone knew, the only 2 serious relationships Deanne had had since the age of 16 were with Morris and Gabby. Now investigators were back to their original theory that revolved around a single killer who may or may not have been known and trusted by both victims. Maybe this person had surprised Morris so completely that Morris never even tried to fight off the shooter. As for Gabby, the autopsy showed that at the time of death, he had 3 times the legal limit of alcohol in his bloodstream, which means he probably would have been too drunk to defend himself from an attacker. Frustrated and baffled, Detective Henderson turned once again to the people who were among the last to see Gabby alive. That group included several members of the coach's so-called wrestling posse, who were a combination of current and former student athletes who had stopped in to visit Gabby on Christmas Eve. According to the boys from this posse, once they were at Gabby's place, they had tried to convince Gabby to come out with them and have some fun. But Gabby had repeatedly said no, he was going to stay put. And so by 12:15 a.m., Gabby's posse gave up and they left, leaving Gabby all alone in his apartment, sitting in his favorite chair, listening to sad love songs. It would not be until Monday, February 23rd, 1976, 3 months after Morris was gunned down outside of his house, and 2 months after Gabby was murdered, that police received the tip that would break the double homicide investigation wide open. 2 days earlier, 2 teenage brothers out fishing off a small island under the twin bridges that crossed the Natchez River had made a totally unexpected discovery. Lying on the bank of that island in about 3 inches of water, the boys had found a rusty, older model .22 caliber automatic pistol with a long barrel. By Monday, their father was standing in Detective Brimmer's office. When the man placed the gun down on the investigator's desk, Detective Brimmer knew immediately that he must be staring at the weapon that had been used to murder both Morris and Gabby. That same day, the Yakima Herald-Republic newspaper reported that a gun had been found in the Natchez River. A few days later, Yakima law enforcement got a visit from the person who claimed not only to own that gun, but who also knew how the gun had turned up in the Natchez River and why. Based on that new information and follow-up interviews conducted by Detectives Brimmer and Henderson and other investigators, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night Morris Blankenbaker was killed and the night 1 month later when Gabby Moore was also shot to death inside of his apartment. It would turn out that Coach Gabby had spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people about how horrible his life had become since Deanne had left him to go back to her first husband, Morris Blankenbaker. And one of those people was listening very carefully to what Gabby had to say. After this person approached Gabby and asked if there was any way to help, Gabby said, actually, yes, there is a way. And by mid-November, Gabby had outlined for this person an entire plan that he felt sure would result in Deanne taking him back. And on the evening of November 21st, when Gabby was in the hospital being treated for the repeated nosebleeds that were a result of his high blood pressure, he decided to put this plan into action. At about 7 p.m., the coach got out of his hospital bed and walked down the corridor to the payphone near the visitor's lobby. He placed one call and then went straight back to his room. 7 hours later, Morris arrived home from his shift as a bouncer at the Lion's Share Tavern. After parking his car in its usual place on the driveway behind his house, Morris sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, enjoying the bottle of beer that he'd brought with him from work. Looking up at the upstairs windows of his house, he thought of the Thanksgiving that he and Deanne would share together with their kids next week. Suddenly, he was just eager to get inside and slip into bed and hold Deanne tightly in his arms. So he turned off the engine and dropped the car keys onto the floor in front of the passenger seat, and then he got out and closed the driver's side door behind him and began walking toward the front of the house. To get there, he walked alongside the south side of the house, the same side of the house that was closest to that alleyway separated from his property only by a short chicken wire fence. When Morris reached the little gate on his property on the south side of his house that separated his backyard from his front yard, he was about to walk through that gate when he heard a voice off to his right somewhere in the alleyway calling out his name. Morris stopped where he was and turned with the beer bottle still in his hand and stared out at the alleyway to see if someone was actually there or if he had just imagined someone calling his name. But sure enough, when he looked at the alleyway, standing there was someone he knew well. Before Morris could react to them, this person told Morris that they had actually just run out of gas, and they gestured toward the end of the alleyway, kind of beckoning Morris to come over and help them. As Morris stepped closer to the chicken wire fence to look down the alleyway toward this person's car, the person in the alleyway raised a hidden pistol, aimed it directly at Morris's face, and fired. The first bullet hit Morris just above his front teeth, and the force of the bullet spun him sideways as he fell to the ground. The second two bullets came in quick succession, hitting Morris just behind his left ear. Without saying another word, Morris's killer turned and ran down the alleyway out of sight. One of the Blankenbaker's neighbors would later tell police that at about 2:10 a.m. on November 22nd, she'd heard what she thought were firecrackers and then the sound of someone in heavy shoes running past her ground floor window. 1 month later, and Gabby was more desperate than ever. His plan to eliminate his rival, Morris, had succeeded, but instead of delivering Deanne back into Gabby's arms, Deanne wanted nothing to do with Gabby. And despite his alibi, Deanne kept telling police that she believed Gabby must have been involved in Morris's murder. And neither Deanne nor investigators seemed to take Gabby's story about him being threatened by the supposed killer all that seriously. So Gabby hatched another, even more complicated plan. And in the first hour of Christmas morning, Gabby was ready to put that plan into effect. By that time, in the first hour of Christmas morning, all the student wrestlers who had dropped by to check on Gabby and to see if he wanted to go out with them that night, the so-called wrestling posse, they had gone. But Gabby knew that one of his visitors would come back. And when that person did arrive, everything would be in place, and Gabby himself would be physically ready for what lay ahead. He had actually been preparing for this moment all evening, all by steadily drinking so much alcohol that he was sure he would hardly feel any pain from what was about to happen. When Gabby's visitor arrived at the coach's house a few minutes later, the two men talked briefly to one another, and then Gabby made his final preparations. Taking the telephone receiver off its hook, he placed it on the living room floor so that it would be easier to reach when he needed to dial 911. And then he went over the plan one more time with Morris's killer, telling him exactly where to aim so when the bullet hit Gabby in the shoulder, it would pass right through him without hitting any critical organs. Gabby was sure that once the public discovered that he himself had been the victim of attempted murder, the police and Deanne would no longer suspect him in Morris's murder. And Gabby was sure that seeing how close he had come to death would reawaken Deanne's love for him. And then, finally, Gabby maneuvered his body into place. Getting down on his hands and knees on the floor, he assumed a wrestling position known as the referee position. And when the gunman, the most brilliant high school wrestler Gabby Moore had ever coached, just stood there, maybe 7 feet away from Gabby, looking like he might refuse to go through with this after all, Gabby turned to look at him and started repeating one word over and over again. Shoot! 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 But just as the young man raised the pistol and finally pulled the trigger, Gabby, too drunk to hold the referee position, lost his balance and started to fall to the side, exposing the area under his left armpit. And instead of the bullet passing cleanly through Gabby's shoulder, the small .22 caliber round ricocheted off one of his ribs and started tumbling through his chest cavity, literally ripping apart his lungs and his heart. It wouldn't be until he heard the news report on Christmas Day that Gabby's accomplice would realize that instead of wounding his coach as planned, the single bullet the young man had fired had actually killed his beloved mentor and friend. It would turn out that the man who killed both Morris and Gabby was Gabby's assistant wrestling coach, a 22-year-old college student named Angelo Pleasant, who went by the nickname Tuffy. Early in the summer of 1975, Tuffy had come back to Yakima to ask his former high school coach if Gabby could help him get the extra credits Tuffy needed in order to get his degree in physical education at Central Washington College in nearby Ellensburg. Gabby was more than happy to pull some strings and offer Tuffy a job as Gabby's assistant wrestling coach. Tuffy, who worshipped his former coach, was deeply upset by the obvious distress Gabby felt over the loss of Deanne. Although he wanted to help Gabby and even asked Gabby, what can I do? It wasn't until his coach threatened to fire Tuffy from his assistant coaching position, something that would mean the end of Tuffy's college career, that Tuffy finally agreed to Gabby's plan to eliminate Morris Blankenbaker as a way for Gabby to get Deanne back. Tuffy agreed to this despite Morris being one of his friends who he had known for years. And when Tuffy later refused to cooperate with Gabby's plan to have Tuffy shoot and just wound Gabby, Gabby threatened to tell police that Tuffy had murdered Morris. In a confession to police on February 28th, Tuffy described how he had felt backed into a corner with no choice but to carry out Gabby's plan. And when Tuffy left Gabby's apartment shortly after midnight on Christmas Day, he had no idea that instead of just wounding Gabby, Tuffy had accidentally killed him. Tuffy didn't even pause after firing that fatal shot. Instead, he had immediately ran out of the apartment and gone to his cousin's house to return the .22 caliber automatic pistol to her. When Tuffy's cousin, Loretta Scott, read about Gabby's death in the newspaper a few hours later, she panicked. She worried that Tuffy may have used her gun to commit these two homicides that were now obviously linked through this gun, and that gun would be traced back to her. So, on December 26, 1975, the day after Christmas, Loretta and her brother drove to the Twin Bridges over the Natchez River and threw the pistol into the water. They had no way of knowing that instead of the gun sinking to the bottom of the river, where it never would have been found, the gun landed on a small island temporarily submerged by the runoff from winter snow and rain. But 2 months later, when Loretta read that short article in the Yakima Herald-Republic reporting that a gun had been found under the bridge in the Natchez River, Loretta decided it was time to go to police and tell them everything she knew. On August 29, 1976, Angelo Tuffy Pleasant was convicted of first-degree murder in the premeditated death of Morris Blankenbaker and sentenced to life in prison. Tuffy was also convicted of second-degree murder for the unintentional death of his coach, Gabby Moore, and sentenced to an additional 20 years in prison. But despite these lengthy sentence terms, Tuffy was released from prison in 1996. On April 18, 1976, 5 months after the murder of her first husband, Morris, and 4 months after the murder of her second husband, Gabby, Deanne Blankenbaker Moore would get married for a third time. This time, the petite brunette with the big dark eyes and soft voice would choose one of the pallbearers who had helped carry Morris's casket down the church aisle at Morris's funeral service less than a half a year earlier. 7 years younger than Deanne, Deanne's new husband would go on to become a successful business person, and Deanne would go on to become a successful stockbroker. Thanks again to the late crime writer Anne Rule, whose 1996 book, Fever in the Heart, helped us to create this podcast. Other sources for this episode include contemporary newspaper articles, documentaries, official records, and magazine articles. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review button to come along for a ride with you in your personal private airplane. But once you're up at altitude, without saying anything, put on the only parachute on board the craft and then jump out. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning. But in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a cold and snowy day in January of 1994, a land surveyor for the North Carolina Department of Transportation parked his car at the edge of Highway 421 in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. After walking just a few yards away from the side of the road, he was already swallowed up in the deep woods that stretched for miles into Watauga County. Given the cold air and snow underfoot, the surveyor was paying close attention to where he was walking and hoping that the job would not take long and he'd be back inside his warm vehicle before his toes actually froze. That was until the man glanced ahead at the fallen tree ahead of him, and before he saw something he just couldn't make sense of peeking out of the snow in the shadow of the upended roots. Squinting, the man took a few more steps closer just to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. A moment later, he dropped the hard plastic case that contained his surveying equipment and nearly fell backward as he scrambled to get away from the mound of snow in front of him. Then, looking desperately through the thick trees for the other members of the survey team, the calm around him was shattered as he started yelling for help. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please buy a billboard along the highway and on it place a massive photo of the Amazon Music follow button when they were in the 4th grade and rocked a sweet bowl cut. Okay, let's get into today's story. "41-year-old Victor Gunnarsson looked out the window of his small apartment in Salisbury, North Carolina. It was Wednesday afternoon, December 1st, 1993, and another mild winter had settled over the Tar Heel state. Even though Victor had lived in America now for almost 8 years, the onset of what passed for cold in this part of the world still brought back sharp memories of the country where Victor was born and where he had expected, at one time, to spend his entire life. If Victor were waking up today in Sweden, 4,500 miles to the north and east of where he stood right now, he'd be welcoming the start of the coldest month of the year, with freezing temperatures that were nearly 20 degrees lower on average than where he lived now, and days so short that the sun would be setting by 3 p.m. in the afternoon. In Sweden, Victor would be piling on wool sweaters and overcoats. Here in Salisbury, he hardly ever had to wear anything warmer than his leather bomber jacket. Turning away from the window, Victor gave himself a small mental shrug. He felt lucky that he didn't miss his homeland more than he did, because for Victor, leaving Sweden had been a matter of necessity, not choice. Back in 1986, Victor's big talk about his anti-communist views, along with his right-wing activism, had gotten him in so much trouble that he'd basically been driven out of his politically liberal homeland. And even if he went back to Sweden's capital city of Stockholm, where he used to live, Victor knew he would not be any more welcome now than he had been 8 years earlier. What still surprised the tall, handsome Swede with the dark hair and intense blue eyes was that he finally felt okay about all of that. When he'd had to leave Stockholm, he'd chosen the US because he'd enjoyed the time he'd once spent vacationing in sunny California, but he'd wound up settling not on the West Coast, but here in central North Carolina, where the weather was warm, cost of living was reasonable, and where the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains were within a day's drive of the Lakewood apartment complex that Victor now called home. And here in the south of the United States, Victor's conservative views didn't raise so many eyebrows, and his naturally gregarious personality had meshed seamlessly with the region's legendary southern hospitality and friendliness. And it hadn't taken Victor long since he'd arrived before he'd put his ability to speak 9 different languages to good use. Within weeks of getting settled here and advertising his services as a language tutor, Victor began to get so many requests for help that he'd had to start putting prospective students on a waiting list. Now, earning $50 an hour, which would be the equivalent of about $100 today, Victor wasn't rich, but he did feel financially comfortable. Victor had also very quickly found his niche in Salisbury as a ladies' man. From the second he had arrived, Victor made no bones about how much he enjoyed female company in every size, shape, and age. And even after the short but passionate affairs that Victor favored ended, he almost always remained on very friendly terms with his former lovers. The South was also a place where Victor, who liked to exaggerate when it came to describing his life experiences, found a willing audience. In addition to his magnetic personality, the fact that he was from Sweden and spoke so many languages gave him an exotic and cosmopolitan gloss that women and men found very interesting. Now, opening up one of the kitchen drawers and picking out a sharp paring knife, Victor thought about the latest woman in his life and smiled. Reaching for the fresh tomatoes that were piled on the counter in front of him, he put one of them on the cutting board and then looked down at his gold watch to check the time. Just 5 days ago, on the Friday after Thanksgiving, Victor had met a local high school teacher named Kay Whedon, who was housing a foreign exchange student from Denmark. And the attraction between Victor and Kay, who was 40 years old and, like Victor, divorced, had been immediate and very strong. The two of them had been brought together by a mutual friend who had told Kay that Kay's exchange student, Mikkel, who was there attending the local high school, might enjoy talking in his native language with Victor. Since that first meeting, Victor and Kay had spent a few more evenings with one another, and while their relationship was still purely platonic, Kay had asked Victor over to her house for dinner tonight so he could meet Mikkel and also Kay's 15-year-old only child, a son named Jason. Victor had been thrilled, and he told Kay not to worry about cooking, that he would provide the food, spaghetti with the homemade sauce he was now in the process of making. And if all went well, Victor thought, as he moved through the steps of a pasta recipe he knew by heart, maybe he and Kay, a smart and attractive woman who taught high school English and drama, would become more than just friends. On Friday, December 3rd, Victor got his wish. Victor's homemade spaghetti dinner 2 evenings earlier had been such a success that Kay was eager to move their relationship forward. Victor had hit it off right away with both Mikkel and Jason, and now Kay wanted Victor to meet one of the most important people in Kay's life, Kay's 77-year-old mother, Catherine Miller. Even though she was 12 years past retirement age, Catherine was still working hard as an accounts clerk at W.A. Brown, an industrial refrigeration company that had been a local fixture in Salisbury for more than 80 years. Now a widow, Catherine devoted her spare time to church and volunteer activities, and to playing a very big role in the lives of her grandson Jason and her only daughter Kay. And ever since Kay had moved to Salisbury after her divorce 6 years ago, Catherine had kept a very protective and, lately, a very worried eye on her daughter's love life. Catherine had heard all about an earlier date Kay had gone on back in November with a man named David Sumner, who Kay had met through a, quote, reputable dating agency, end quote. Their first get-together at a local lunch spot was promising, but the dinner date that followed a few days later had turned out to be a disaster. So when Kay had started talking about this intelligent and good-looking man named Victor, who was so different from Kay's expectation that a Swede would be pale-skinned and blonde, Catherine was very interested in meeting the new person in Kay's life. And when Kay had asked Catherine to join Kay and Victor at the Blue Bay Seafood Restaurant that night of December 3rd, Catherine hadn't hesitated even a second before saying yes. And now, as the three of them sat at a table for four near a window at Blue Bay and placed their dinner orders, Catherine thought that overall, Victor seemed friendly and courteous. He was definitely a talker, except when it came to exactly why he had left his home in Sweden's capital city of Stockholm 8 years earlier. But then again, Catherine thought to herself, everyone had their secrets, and Catherine wondered how much Kay had told Victor about the problems that Kay had been having in her own life. It wasn't until the end of the meal, when Victor took his last bite of his baked potato and motioned to the server that he was ready for the check, that dinner hit one small sour note. That was when Victor took the money that Catherine had offered to him to cover the cost of her own meal, but instead of giving Catherine any change or refusing Catherine's offer, Victor used Catherine's money to pay the entire tab, and the only contribution he made was to take a few dollars from his pocket and tuck them under his plate for the tip. A few minutes later, as Catherine, Victor, and Kay stood up and put on their coats before heading out the door and into the cool night air to the parking lot, Kay, who had also noticed this telltale sign that Victor was very likely tight with money, gave her mother an embarrassed shrug. Maybe, Catherine thought, as Victor held the car door of Kay's car open for Catherine to slide in before he stepped away to get into his own car to drive back to Lakewood Apartments where he lived, Victor didn't hate the welfare state, which is how he described Sweden, quite as much as he said he did, because he certainly didn't mind taking from the person who was supposed to be his guest. But later that night, when Kay and Victor were sitting outside in Kay's yard next to the fire pit, Kay at least had put that single awkward moment at the restaurant out of her mind. After dropping her mother off at 118 Larch Road and reminding her mom to make sure her alarm system was on for the night, Kay had headed back to her own house to wait for Victor, who had wanted to go to his own apartment and change into more comfortable clothing before coming back to join Kay. When Victor arrived at Sycamore Road, Jason and Mikkel were out with friends, which meant Kay and Victor had 3 hours alone together. When Jason and Mikkel got back to the house at about 10 p.m., Kay and Victor joined the teens and a few of their friends out in the side yard to enjoy a fire in the fire pit. Now, as Kay and Victor sat next to one another, their fingers entwined, Kay noticed the glint of a small diamond set in the heavy gold signet ring that Victor always wore on his left hand. When Kay asked about the ring, Victor took it off and told her that the 3 letters engraved around the diamond meant strength and courage. As their eyes met over the ring, Kay's heart skipped a beat, especially after the hours that she and Victor had just spent alone. Kay hoped that there would be many more evenings just like this in the months ahead. Those thoughts were interrupted a few minutes later when Kay was startled by the sight of a car pulling into the end of her driveway. But a moment later, when she saw the car was just using her driveway to turn around and head back the way it had just come, she forced her shoulders to relax. An hour later, at about 11:15, Victor gave Kay's hand a gentle squeeze, then leaned over and told her that it was time for him to go back to his own apartment. And 10 minutes after that, while Jason and his friends were still enjoying the fire, Kay was standing just inside the front door of the house saying goodnight to Victor. After a long kiss, Victor stepped back, smiled, and promised Kay he would call her the next day. Then, as Kay watched, the big man with black hair and intense blue eyes shoved his hands deep into his pockets, walked down the porch steps, and back to his car. 35 days later, and 100 miles northwest of Salisbury, a land surveyor working with a North Carolina state highway crew up in Watauga County was picking his way through the dense woods off Highway 421, near the summit of one of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The highway department service vehicles were parked about 300 yards away alongside the edge of an entrance ramp leading onto the Blue Ridge Parkway, a scenic route through the mountain range that was closed at the moment due to uncleared ice and snow. As soon as the surveyor had stepped out of the warm vehicle, the cold mountain air and wind hit him like a fist, but after just a few steps, he had entered the relative shelter of thick trees. As he moved through the snow, the man's eyes swept back and forth across the ground just ahead of him. He didn't want to take any chances that he might miss the iron property marker he was looking for. After making his way around a large clump of mountain laurel, the surveyor stopped for a second to look up and take stock of his surroundings. Directly in front of him was a huge pine tree that had fallen or been knocked over by the wind. Facing the surveyor were the upended and snow-covered roots of the tree. And in the indentation in the earth where all those roots had once dug into the ground, the surveyor suddenly noticed something out of place in the snow just a few steps in front of him. The surveyor squinted, sure that his eyes were playing tricks on him. Then, moving much more slowly now, the man took one more step closer and then froze. Sticking out of the white snow immediately in front of the surveyor were two bare human feet. The toes and flesh of one foot had been chewed down to the bone by small animals, but the big toe on the left foot, large with a bristle of black hairs, a man's foot, was still intact. Suddenly gagging, the surveyor stumbled backward, then turned and ran a few yards back along the path he had just made through the snow. Then, pausing to catch his breath and looking over his shoulder again at the fallen pine tree, he dropped his case of equipment into the snow, opened his mouth, and yelled for help. By 2 p.m., the entrance ramp to the Blue Ridge Parkway was crowded with law enforcement vehicles and personnel. In response to the 911 call that had come in a few minutes earlier from the state highway crew reporting that what appeared to be a man's dead body had been found in the woods, 2 patrol cars from the Watauga County Sheriff's Department had been first on the scene, where they were soon joined by members of the Blue Ridge National Park Service. By the time Detective Sergeant Paula May from the Division of Criminal Investigations in the Watauga Sheriff's Department had arrived, the area around the fallen pine tree was taped off, and the surveyor, who had discovered the body under a mound of snow in the shadow of the upended tree roots, couldn't wait to give his statement to police and then get out of the woods and back into a warm car as fast as possible. Detective May couldn't blame him. The temperature, already well below freezing, was dropping steadily. And this was only the beginning of what the 6-year veteran with the Sheriff's Department knew would be a very long and very cold night. But in this case, the investigator also knew that in this situation, the cold and snow might work to the advantage of law enforcement. The large body that was clearly buried, except for the feet, under a mound of snow near the fallen pine tree had probably been well preserved by the recent cold temperatures. And if decomposition had been minimal, then the body might yield valuable clues about the identity of this person, along with the cause and time of their death. But aside from her assumption, based on the feet and the size of the body under the snow, that the victim was a man, the fact that the victim appeared to be naked raised more questions than answers. It basically ruled out 2 of the more common causes of death out here in the woods, suicide or an accident. And that left the third option, that what she was looking at here was likely a homicide. And that would open the door to a very complicated investigation because murders could be committed for all kinds of reasons and by all kinds of people. And unless police found the man's clothing and some form of ID, there was also the challenge of finding out who this victim was. Detective May knew at the moment there were no active reports of missing people in Watauga County. And even before she left the woods later that evening, she also knew that one of her first tasks would be to check on missing person reports outside of the county, both in the larger region and statewide. Within a few hours of Detective May's arrival, the Watauga County Sheriff had already made a call to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation asking for help. And not long after that, the area around the snow-covered body began to fill with members of a state crime tech unit and an agent assigned to work closely with Detective May. It wasn't until after the scene was photographed, sketched, and processed that the medical examiner oversaw the removal of the body. And after one small scoop of snow at a time had been lifted off the corpse, investigators finally got their first look at the nude adult white male who lay underneath the mound of snow. The bare skin of the man's back was frozen to the ground. His wide open mouth showed a set of straight white teeth. In his left temple, just below the line of dark hair that still covered what was left of his scalp, investigators could see a clearly defined circle where a bullet had been fired into his skull. And on the right side of the man's neck, there was a second bullet hole. There was no sign anywhere of the man's clothes, and no shell casings from the rounds that were fired, but the body was not completely stripped. On the man's left wrist was a gold watch, and on his left hand he wore a heavy gold signet ring with a small center diamond. The only other physical item left at the scene of what investigators now knew had to have been a murder was a 16-inch long strip of electrical and masking tape, the same kind of tape that investigators would later find had been used to bind the man's hands and ankles. By the next morning, when the medical examiner was preparing to conduct an autopsy on the body found in the woods the night before, Detective May had already made much more progress on the case than she had believed possible when she had first laid eyes on the dead man. In fact, she now believed she had identified their John Doe. The young detective had spent the night before at her office putting out a statewide call for active reports on missing adult middle-aged white males. And within hours, she had gotten a call from the police department in Salisbury, North Carolina, 90 miles to the southeast. The lieutenant told her about a 41-year-old Swedish national named Victor Gunnarsson who had been reported missing by his landlord 23 days earlier on December 15, 1993. Victor's physical description, 41 years old, 6 foot 2 inches tall, 225 pounds, matched what Detective May had seen in the woods. But it was the recent photograph attached to the missing persons report from Salisbury that made the investigator's heart beat faster. The man in the photo with the dark hair and straight white teeth was wearing a gold watch and a heavy gold signet ring that looked exactly like the jewelry she had seen on the dead man in the woods. But it was what the Salisbury investigator told Detective May next, when she asked what else the officer knew about Victor Gunnarsson, that literally took Detective May's breath away. Because, as Detective May was about to find out, Victor Gunnarsson was no ordinary Swedish citizen. Victor Gunnarsson was in fact a major player in a political assassination that had taken place 8 years earlier, an assassination that was still unsolved and still the subject of international intrigue and speculation. That assassination had taken place on the evening of Friday, February 28, 1986, in the capital city of Stockholm, Sweden, when the country's popular prime minister and his wife, unescorted by bodyguards, were walking home from an evening out at the movies. The assassin had walked up behind the couple and fired 2 bullets at close range. The first hit Olof Palme in the back, killing him almost instantly, while the second bullet grazed and slightly injured Palme's wife, Lisbeth. And among the first suspects in that high-profile homicide was Victor Gunnarsson. Known at the time to Swedish police for his right-wing extremist views, Victor had been spotted earlier that same evening in a nearby bar where he had been heard ranting about the Prime Minister's socialist economic and foreign policies. Within hours of the shooting, Victor, who was then 33 years old, was picked up for questioning and then let go, only to be brought back into police custody 2 more times for detention and interrogation. He was finally released after an eyewitness to the assassination could not positively identify Victor as the shooter. But being released from police custody was not at all the same thing as being cleared of suspicion. As long as the case went unsolved, Victor remained a person of interest. As the target of continued surveillance as well as public mistrust, Victor had trouble keeping a job and living a normal life. So, after receiving a settlement for wrongful detention from the government, Victor decided it was time to leave Sweden and start a new life in America, where he eventually settled in Salisbury, North Carolina. Within days of Detective May's discovery, Swedish officials were able to confirm that the fingerprints taken from the man found in the North Carolina woods did match those of Victor Gunnarsson. By that time, the autopsy report had also come back. The contents in Victor's stomach, which included bits of potato skin, showed that he had probably eaten dinner about 4 hours before his death. The medical examiner had also determined that Victor had been bound with masking and electrical tape and confirmed that Victor had been killed execution style with 1 bullet to the head and 1 to the throat. The cause of death immediately ignited speculation in the US and in Sweden that Victor himself had become the victim of an assassination, and that his death must be related somehow to the 1986 murder of the Swedish Prime Minister. But as detectives in both Watauga County, where Victor's body was found, and in Salisbury, where Victor lived, began to work the homicide case together, what increasingly drew their attention wasn't just Victor's link to an 8-year-old political assassination, it was Victor's link to Salisbury resident and high school teacher Kay Whedon. What made that link interesting to detectives was the fact that Victor was not the only recent homicide victim who had lived in Salisbury and been a part of Kay's life. By now, results from Victor's autopsy, coupled with information detectives had gathered from Victor's friends and neighbors and from Kay herself, had helped police narrow the date of Victor's actual death to early December, probably around December 3rd, which was when Victor had gone out to dinner with Kay and eaten the baked potato, bits of which were later found inside of his stomach. And it was just a few days after December 3rd, on December 9th, that Kay Whedon's mother, 77-year-old Catherine Miller, had also been murdered. And like Victor, she had been shot twice in the head at close range. So, even as Detective May and law enforcement from the state and Salisbury Police Department continued to track down any information they could about Victor's political activities here in the United States, investigators also focused their attention on finding out all they could about Kay, the one person who represented the strongest link between two very similar brutal homicides that claimed the lives of two Salisbury residents. By the time Detective May joined forces with Salisbury investigators in mid-January, Salisbury police had already discovered that Kay herself also appeared to be in potential danger. Since Victor's disappearance and the death of her mother, Kay and her son Jason had both become the targets of telephone calls and letters accusing Jason of involvement with local drug dealers and threatening both mother and son with physical violence. When Kay sat down with investigators to tell them about her relationship with Victor, she told detectives that she had been crushed when Victor had not followed through on his promise to call her the day after their dinner together at the Blue Bay restaurant on December 3rd. But any worry or hurt Kay had felt about Victor's sudden silence and apparent disappearance, and any concern over the apparent stalker or stalkers who had started sending these awful letters and calling her and her son at all hours to threaten them, had been totally blotted out of her mind when she received the terrible news on December 9th that her mother had been murdered. That was the morning that Catherine's body had been found by a coworker from W.A. Brown, who had been so concerned that Catherine was late to work that he went directly to her home on Larch Street to make sure she was okay. When the coworker had stepped into Catherine's kitchen, he'd been horrified to find Catherine slumped in a seated position on the floor, her back against a white refrigerator and the top of her head blown off. After ruling out both Kay and her son Jason as suspects, police concentrated first on interviewing Catherine's friends and coworkers. Even though Catherine's house had a security system installed, there was no sign of forced entry, which made police believe the older woman must have known her attacker and opened the door to let them in. But after finding zero evidence that anyone close to Catherine would want her dead, police turned their attention again to Kay, thinking that Catherine's murder might be connected to something going on in Kay's life, or to someone close to Kay. People of interest had included Kay's former boyfriend, a Salisbury police officer named Lamont Claxton Underwood, who worked as a resource officer at Salisbury High School, as well as other men like David Sumner, who Kay had dated after she broke up with Officer Underwood and before she met Victor Gunnarsson. But no matter how hard they probed, detectives couldn't find any physical evidence to link anyone in Kay's circle of friends and acquaintances to the murder of Catherine Miller. But after the discovery of Victor's body, investigators in Salisbury had additional leads to follow. It looked to Detective May and Salisbury's lead investigator Don Gale like Victor Gunnarsson must have been kidnapped from his home in Salisbury and transported, probably by car, up to Watauga County where he was actually killed. But even after circling back to Officer Underwood, who had re-entered Kay's life as a friend after Kay's mother had died, and who had access to firearms, police still came up empty. All police discovered when they searched their fellow officer's home and car on February 1st, 1994, was that Lamont Claxton, LC for short, was neat to the point of being compulsive about order and cleanliness. As for a connection between Victor's murder and the assassination of Sweden's prime minister in 1986, that lead also petered out. Years before, Victor had apparently cut his ties to any right-wing extremist groups, and state and local police in North Carolina could not find one scrap of evidence among Victor's personal belongings or information gathered through interviews with his associates that related in any way to the death of Prime Minister Olof Palme. By the fall of 1994, 11 months after Victor Gunnarsson disappeared from his apartment in Salisbury, all the main characters in the unsolved murders of Victor and also Catherine Miller had started to move on with their lives. Kay, unable to stand being so close to the home where her mother had died, sold her house on Sycamore Road and moved to a new home 5 miles to the south, and the harassment that had terrorized her and Jason stopped. Both Kay and Elsie Underwood each had new romantic partners, and no one had stepped forward to claim a $50,000 reward offered by North Carolina's governor for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Victor's murderer, just as no one in Salisbury or Watauga County responded to a police bulletin asking for information about the .22 caliber weapon used to kill Victor, or the .38 caliber weapon used to kill Catherine. It wouldn't be until the fall of 1995, almost 2 years after Salisbury's 24,000 residents had been shaken to the core by those two homicides, that Watauga County Detective Paula May and Salisbury Detective Don Gale would get the news they had been hoping for, news that would once again shine the international spotlight on Victor Gunnarsson. On Wednesday, October 11th, an analyst for the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation placed a call to Detective May at her office up in the northwest corner of the state. After almost 2 years of reviewing the evidence and material samples that had been collected in the course of the Victor Gunnarsson investigation and finding nothing that would ID the murderer, the forensics expert had been ready to give up. But as he packed away one particular piece of material, he made a completely unexpected discovery. And using a brand new tool for analyzing DNA, the agent now believed he knew who had kidnapped and killed Kay's one-time boyfriend, Victor. Based on the results of that DNA test and the information investigators had gathered over the last 2 years, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Victor Gunnarsson on the night of December 3rd, 1993, and what happened to Catherine Miller 5 days later on the night of December 9th. It was right around midnight, and the moon was covered by clouds when Victor's killer turned into the parking lot at Lakewood Apartments and spotted Victor's big gray Lincoln Town car parked right in front of Unit 910. The killer smiled at the lighted window of Victor's apartment. That was good. That meant the big Swede was still awake. Pulling the burgundy-colored Monte Carlo sedan in as close to Victor's unit as possible, the killer rolled to a stop and turned off the engine. Before leaving the car, the killer checked that they had everything they needed. Then there was the soft clunk as the car door closed, and then the quiet slap of footsteps as the killer walked to the front door of Victor's unit and rang the bell. A moment later, there was the sound of movement inside the apartment, then the doorknob turned, and the big friendly Swede suddenly appeared standing right inside. But the expression of puzzled welcome on Victor's face didn't last long. As soon as the door had opened, the killer was on the move, crowding Victor further back into the house and pulling out the .22 caliber pistol borrowed from a friend. Before Victor even had time to wrap his mind around what had just happened and who was standing inside his home, Victor was being forced out the door of his apartment, bands of tape covering his mouth and binding his hands tightly behind his back. Prodding Victor ahead of him to the Monte Carlo, the killer popped open the trunk and forced Victor to climb inside the cramped compartment, before quickly wrapping Victor's ankles together with more strips of electrical and masking tape. Then there was another clunk as the killer closed the trunk and stepped around to the driver's side, hopped behind the wheel, and turned on the engine. The killer paused just long enough to take a few calming breaths before easing slowly out of the apartment complex, the door to Victor's unit still open. The drive north from Salisbury to the intersection of Route 421 and the Blue Ridge Mountain Parkway took about an hour and 45 minutes. Coming from the rear of the car, the killer could hear the sound of Victor kicking at the top and sides of the trunk and the occasional scrape of something hard that sounded like metal on metal. As the killer approached the entrance ramp to the parkway, they slowed down, pulled over, and then parked the car. Here in the mountains, the edges of the road gave way almost immediately to thick, dense forest. And at this time of the year, when the parkway closed due to winter snow and ice, it could be months or never before anyone wandered into these woods. which was good because that meant the killer could finish this thing without hiking more than 300 or 400 yards into that black tangle of branches. Another calming breath, and the killer had gotten out of the driver's seat, closed the car door, and walked to the trunk. All the thumping and scraping had stopped. Time to pop the trunk, cut the bindings around Victor's ankles, and bring part 1 of the killer's plan to a close. A few minutes later, after forcing Victor to walk ahead at gunpoint up a slight hill, the killer skirted around the edge of a thicket of mountain laurel, then ordered Victor to stop walking. Facing them was the upended root ball of a fallen pine tree. Backing Victor into the shallow depression just in front of the snow-covered roots, the killer ordered Victor to strip off all of his clothes. Then, the killer wrapped a strip of masking and electrical tape around Victor's forehead. Pressing the barrel of the .22 against the tape on the left side of Victor's temple, right at the hairline, the killer pulled the trigger. Once Victor had fallen backward into the snow, the killer crouched down and quickly fired a second shot through the right side of Victor's throat. A moment later, and the killer had picked up the 2 spent shell casings and was pulling off the tape from around Victor's mouth and forehead and hands and adding the strips with their incriminating load of DNA from Victor's hair and skin to the pile of Victor's clothing. As the killer's adrenaline rush started to wear off, the killer was suddenly shaky and very eager to get out of the dark woods. With any luck, no one would ever see Victor Gunnarsson again. The winter, snow, cold, and wild animals who would scatter his bones all over the forest would make sure of that. As the killer gathered up trace evidence and stood to walk back out to the road, the killer never noticed the 16-inch long strip of masking and electrical tape they had dropped close to Victor's bare feet. 5 days later, Victor's killer was ready to complete the second part of their plan. All the risks were worth it, because after this, the killer was sure that the life they had wanted and planned would finally be within reach. So, on the evening of December 8, 1993, the killer knocked at the front door of Catherine Miller's house at 118 Larch Road. The single-story brick ranch was set far back from the road, so anyone driving by would have a hard time recognizing the person who stood with their back to the street at the top of the front steps. After the killer called out and identified themselves, the door opened. Catherine looked surprised and not completely pleased, but she still stepped back to allow her visitor inside. With the same wave of excitement the killer had felt entering Victor's apartment a few days earlier, the killer now pushed quickly into Catherine's living area. The sooner this was done, the better. Pulling out the gun, this time it was a .38 caliber revolver, the killer forced Catherine through the front of her house to the kitchen out back. There was a pan of beans for Catherine's dinner heating on the stove, and a copy of that day's Salisbury Post newspaper lying on the kitchen table. Catherine had turned, and then with no place left to go, she came to a stop with her back pressed against the refrigerator. Then, as the killer closed the distance left between them, Catherine stumbled, slipped, or simply slid down the door of the refrigerator until she was in a sitting position on the floor. Then, standing next to her, the killer fired 2 bullets down into the top of Catherine's head, sending fragments of bones, scalp, and hair in a spray along the floor and ceiling, and leaving a fan of blood spatter against the white refrigerator door. Stepping back, and careful to avoid stepping in any blood, the killer spent a few minutes staging the house to look like Catherine had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. But the only thing of any value that police would find missing was Catherine's purse. Satisfied with their work, the killer left Catherine's house, returned to their car, started up the engine, and drove away, already thinking ahead to the sequence of events that would begin tomorrow morning. As soon as police discovered Catherine's dead body, they would inform Catherine's daughter, who lived just a few blocks away. And that was the moment when Salisbury police officer L.C. Underwood would be ready to reap the reward of having murdered the 2 people who stood between him and Kay Wheaton, the woman he loved and wanted. With Victor gone, L.C. had eliminated his chief romantic rival, and with Catherine Miller dead, L.C. had eliminated the person closest to Kay, and the person who had never approved of her daughter's involvement with the police officer who had heard all about how L.C. Underwood had showed up at the restaurant where Kay had met David Sumner for dinner, threatened to hurt both of them, and then dumped a full glass of iced tea right into Kay's lap. Now, with Victor and Catherine dead, Not only would LC become Kay's indispensable man, LC was also the only person who could put an end to the harassment that had made Kay's life miserable ever since she had broken off her engagement to him a little over 1 year earlier. That part would be easy, since it was LC himself who had been Kay's stalker all along, sending her those threatening letters he had typed on a typewriter at his work office, and arranging for an ex-convict LC knew to harass Kay by phone. Just as it had been so easy for LC Underwood to drive by Kay Wheaton's house on the night of December 3rd, when Kay and Victor sat holding hands together outside by the fire pit, turn around in the end of her driveway and take down the license number of Victor's car, then call up a buddy on the police force to run the plates and give LC Victor's home address. And not only had LC been able to use the power of his badge to help commit murder, his job as a police officer would allow him to keep an eye on the investigation into both deaths and stay one step ahead of investigators. But what LC Underwood did not expect when he killed both Victor and Catherine was that despite his mania for cleanliness and sanitizing a crime scene, he would leave behind 3 critical pieces of evidence that would eventually lead to his arrest. It would turn out that even before Catherine Miller had been murdered, Salisbury police, who were investigating Kay Wheaton's reports that someone was harassing her, had already developed evidence that Kay's own ex-boyfriend, LC Underwood, was also Kay's stalker. Police had seized the typewriter ribbon from LC's work typewriter at the local high school where he was a resource officer. That typewriter ribbon was the first piece of critical evidence that would eventually tie LC to murder. On that typewriter ribbon, police found words that appeared in the letters of harassment that Kay had shown police. Even though Kay herself had refused to believe that LC could be her stalker, when Kay's mother, Catherine, was murdered, LC, who had been vocal about his run-ins with Catherine, quickly became investigators' primary suspect. But it wasn't until Victor Gunnarson's body was discovered, naked and dead up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, that police were able to collect the second and third pieces of evidence that would send LC to prison. When police searched LC's house back in February of 1993, almost 2 months after Victor's disappearance, they found a roll of electrical tape that they were later able to identify as the same kind of tape as the strip of tape that police found at the scene of Victor's murder. And during that same search, in the trunk of LC's Monte Carlo, there were boot prints and scratches on the underside of the lid. And even though LC had had the car thoroughly and professionally cleaned, when detectives sent in the mats from the bottom of the trunk to the state crime lab for examination, forensic specialists would eventually recover 17 hairs embedded in the mat fibers. The call that Detective Paula May had received on October 11, 1995, was confirmation from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab that DNA from all 17 of those hairs found in the trunk of LC Underwood's Monte Carlo were a match for Victor Gunnarsson. On October 13, 1995, one day after receiving those DNA results, and just under 2 years after Victor disappeared, police arrested 44-year-old police officer LC Underwood and charged him with first-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping in the death of Swedish national Victor Gunnarsson. 3.5 years later, on Monday, July 21, 1997, Lamont Claxton Underwood was found guilty of both charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Although the court allowed the prosecution to present evidence from Catherine Miller's murder as part of the state's case against LC Underwood was never formally charged with Catherine's murder. On Christmas Day 2018, after serving 21 years of his life sentence, LC Underwood died in prison of kidney cancer at the age of 67. In June 2020, 34 years after Victor Gunnarsson was questioned as a possible suspect in the assassination of Sweden's Prime Minister Olof Palme, Swedish prosecutors announced that they had finally solved the puzzle of who really did shoot Olof Palme. According to prosecutors, the man, who had no connection to Victor, was a professional graphic designer who had put himself forward at the time of the assassination as an eyewitness to the Prime Minister's death. As for Victor Gunnarsson, twice in his life, the big talker with the big smile was in absolutely the wrong place at absolutely the wrong time. His first piece of bad luck, when he was in a bar nearby the place where Olof Palme was gunned down, resulted in Victor's persecution and his move to the United States. The second piece of bad luck, when he met Kay Wheaton, a woman he would date for less than a month, resulted in Victor's death. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only available on YouTube. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of Sunday, November 17th, 1991, two brothers were driving in their pickup truck down a road in the small town of Conway, South Carolina. The older brother was driving, and the younger brother was looking out the window at the surrounding woods, looking for the perfect spot to set up to go deer hunting. But as they rolled along, suddenly the younger brother said, "Hey, I see something." And so the brother quickly pulled over, parked the truck, they both got out, and the older brother was expecting his younger brother to head into the woods and show him what he found. But instead, the younger brother didn't go to the woods. He turned towards the middle of the road right out in front of their vehicle, and he stopped in front of this big stain on the ground. When the older brother walked up next to him, they both looked down and they could tell this was a huge pool of dried blood. In fact, there was so much blood that the brothers thought maybe a big predator had attacked a deer, and they worried that this big predator might still be close by. But then the brothers noticed a trail of blood leading away from the center of the road into a ditch nearby. So they followed the blood trail, they reached the ditch, and they stared down into it. Seconds later, the brothers were running for their truck so they could go alert police. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to fill up the ice tray for the Amazon Music follow button, but instead of water, use bleach. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Saturday, November 16th, 1991, a 17-year-old high school senior named Crystal Todd was in her bedroom getting ready to go to a party in the small town she lived in, which was called Conway, South Carolina. Crystal looked at herself in the mirror and put the finishing touches on her makeup. Then she stepped back to get a full view of herself. She was wearing a print shirt, jeans, brown leather shoes, and her favorite brown leather jacket. And in the mirror, her blue eyes shined. Her mom always told her that her eyes were bluer than the sky, and they lit up any room she walked into. After checking herself over a few more times, Crystal felt happy with how she looked, and she was about to head out for the night when the phone in her bedroom started to ring. She answered it, but right away she wished that she hadn't. A young man named Davey, who Crystal had gone out with on a few dates, was the caller. Crystal had told Davey that she did not want to see him anymore, but clearly he had not gotten the message. Davey asked Crystal if she wanted to go out with him that night, but Crystal said she already had plans, so she couldn't. So Davey said, "Okay, well, can we get together another time soon?" Crystal had always been taught to be polite, so she took a deep breath and in a sweet voice told Davey again that she did not think they should see each other anymore, but she hoped they could still be friends. Then Crystal hung up the phone, grabbed her purse, and headed into the living room where her mom was sitting on the couch. She told her mom that she was going out and gave her a hug. Her mom reminded her to be home by 12:30, and Crystal just smiled and nodded. Crystal almost never missed her curfew, and even if she was going to be home just a few minutes late, she always called her mom ahead of time to let her know. So Crystal said goodbye to her mom and stepped outside onto the large wooden porch in front of their traditional country-style house. Then Crystal walked across the yard to her new blue Toyota Celica car parked out front. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the car, and immediately felt a rush of excitement. Crystal loved this car. It had been an early graduation present from her mom. Her mom had even gotten her vanity license plates that read, C. Todd. Crystal leaned across the passenger seat, opened up the glove compartment, and grabbed a cassette tape from inside. She put the tape into her stereo, turned the music up loud, and then pulled away from her house and turned onto a tree-lined road that led toward the center of town. Just being behind the wheel of her beautiful new car gave Crystal a sense of freedom that she rarely felt in this small town where almost everyone knew everyone else's business. And as she drove, she looked out at the dense woods that surrounded most of Conway and thought about what her life would be like once she finally left her hometown. Crystal loved her mom and her friends, but she dreamed of driving her new car out of Conway and going to college in another city where she could finally meet some new people and have some new experiences. Crystal finally reached the center of town and drove past the shopping mall and a few fast food restaurants. Then she turned onto a side road, and after following that road for a few miles, she arrived at the house where the party was going to be that night. When Crystal stepped inside the house was already packed with teenagers, and music was blaring from the stereo. One of Crystal's friends immediately came up to her and asked if she was meeting Davy there. Crystal frowned and said no, she was not, and she actually hoped Davy would not show up to this party at all. But Crystal would tell this friend that there actually was another guy Crystal was hoping to see at this party. But when Crystal's friend asked her who this guy was, Crystal just smiled and didn't say anything, like she was keeping a big secret. Then Crystal poured herself a beer into a red plastic cup and stepped away into the crowded living room. Crystal was fairly short. She was only 5 foot 3 inches tall, so once she was in the room, she got up on her toes and craned her neck to see over everybody in the room, but she didn't see the guy she was hoping to see. So she weaved her way through the crowd and found her way to the living room couch. For the next couple of hours, Crystal sat right there drinking a beer, periodically scanning the crowd in hopes of seeing this new guy, but he never appeared. And as Crystal scanned the room that night, she started to become more and more aware of all the happy couples dancing and talking to each other, and it started to make her feel really lonely. And as she started to feel lonely, she suddenly wished that her really good friend, Ken Register, had been there that night. Ken and Crystal had been friends since they were kids, and whenever they were together, Crystal never seemed to get bored. But Ken had graduated a year earlier, and he made it a point now not to hang out at high school parties. Finally, at around 11 p.m., when still this guy had not shown up to the party, Crystal got up from the couch, she made her rounds around the house saying goodbye to her friends, and then she headed back outside. The music from the party faded as she got into her blue car, and then after firing up the engine, she began driving back toward the center of town along the dark road. After a few minutes, Crystal passed the mall's brightly lit parking lot and then glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It was only 11:15, which meant she had a little over an hour before she had to be home for curfew. And Crystal was not about to waste an hour of freedom, so she decided she would at least go out and get some fast food before heading home. After driving a little further down the road, in the direction of the nearest fast food restaurant, Crystal eased off the gas and stopped at a traffic light. She turned up her music even louder and started singing out loud, but then she heard a car horn blaring over the music. She thought she must have missed the green light, but when she looked up, she saw it was still red. She heard the horn again and realized the car that was honking was right next to her. Crystal looked out her passenger side window at this other car, and when she saw who was driving it, she immediately smiled and waved, and the other driver rolled down their window, and Crystal did the same. She rolled down her passenger side window. Then the other driver, while shouting over the music, asked if Crystal wanted to hang out. Crystal's smile instantly grew much wider, and she said yes, definitely. She had about an hour until she had to go home. A moment later, the light turned green, so Crystal drove forward and pulled into the parking lot of a nearby middle school and parked. The other driver followed her. Crystal grabbed her keys and got out of her car, but left her purse behind. Then she made her way over to this other driver's car, she hopped in the passenger seat, and they took off. At 1 a.m. on November 17th, so about 2 hours after Crystal had left that party, her friend, Ken Register, who she had hoped would be at that party with her, was getting ready for bed. Ken had worked his construction job all week and then spent the previous night with his girlfriend at the go-kart track. He was exhausted and he knew he still had to get up early for church. But before he could lie down in bed, his telephone rang. He figured it must be his girlfriend calling to say goodnight, so he reached over and grabbed the phone, but right away he knew it was not his girlfriend and something was terribly wrong. Crystal's mom was the one calling him, and she was frantic. She said Crystal still was not home and had not called her to say she'd be late. And so Crystal's mom asked Ken if he knew where she was or if he had seen her that night. Ken told her that he had not been with Crystal that night, so he didn't know where she was, but he reassured her that, Crystal was probably just out with friends and had lost track of time and would be home soon. But nothing Ken said seemed to calm Crystal's mother down. Instead, she just kept saying, "Ken, I really think something is wrong. She's never late. And if she's going to be, she always calls." And so Ken, who had known Crystal's mom since he was a little kid and could really tell this was a crisis point for her, he told her, "Look, I'll call the 2 closest hospitals and see if maybe she's in one of those." And so Crystal's mom thanked Ken, and he told her he would call her right back after he called the hospitals. After Ken hung up with Crystal's mom, he would call both hospitals, but neither had any records of Crystal ever having come in that night. So Ken called Crystal's mom back and gave her the news, but he told her again that, Crystal was fine. She likely just lost track of time, or maybe she got sucked into dropping someone off who lived far away, but don't worry, she'll be home, everything's fine. Crystal's mom was not buying it, but she did say to Ken that while he was calling the hospitals, she had called the police, and they too told her that this did not seem like a big deal, and that likely Crystal would be home soon. Ken felt terrible for Crystal's mom, but there really wasn't much else he could do, and so eventually they both just said, "Okay, we'll be in touch if we hear from Crystal," and then they hung up, and a little while later, Ken was asleep. At around 9 a.m., 8 hours after Crystal's mom had called Ken, 2 brothers in their 20s were driving down a road in Conway in their pickup truck. The older of the 2 was driving, while the younger brother was scanning the woods outside. He was looking for a good spot to start their deer hunt for the day. And just then, the younger brother said he saw something. So the older brother, who was driving, pulled over to the side of the road and parked, and then after they both got out, the older brother expected the younger brother to head towards the woods to show him what he saw. But instead, the younger brother walked ahead in the middle of the road and stopped over this big stain on the ground. And when the older brother walked up next to him, they both looked down and they could see clearly it was a huge pool of dried blood. In fact, there was so much blood on the concrete that the brothers thought maybe some big wild predator must have attacked a deer in the area, and they both worried that maybe this wild predator was still close by. But then the younger brother pointed to a trail of blood that led from the road to a nearby ditch about 10 feet away. The men looked at each other and then followed the blood trail, and when they got to the other side of the road and looked down into this ditch that was about 5 feet deep, what they saw at the bottom stunned them both into silence. Finally, the older brother snapped out of his daze and started running back towards the truck, and his younger brother followed him. The 2 of them climbed into the truck, and before long they were peeling out of there, speeding down the road as fast as they could to alert the police. A little after 10 a.m., so about an hour after those brothers made a 911 call, Detective Bill Knowles of the Horry County Police parked his car on the side of the road near the woods and stared out his window at the other police officers who were gathered around the ditch on the opposite side of the road where the brothers had made their ghastly discovery. Knowles stepped out of his car and stretched. It was sunny and very mild that morning. Then, as soon as he was out of his car, one of the officers spotted him and waved him over to the ditch. Knowles walked slowly across the road, staring down at the massive trail of dried blood. Then he reached the officer and looked down into the ditch below. Knowles' breath caught in his chest, and a look of complete shock crossed his face. He had known he was coming to investigate a murder, but the brutality that had been inflicted on the victim he was now staring at was beyond anything he'd seen before. The victim had suffered multiple stab wounds, and whoever killed this person had been filled with a level of rage that Knowles could barely comprehend. Knowles asked the other officers at the scene if they had any details about who the victim was, but they told him that they hadn't located any identification or any vehicle nearby that might help them determine who this person was. So Knowles climbed into the ditch, he crouched down closer to the body, and began inspecting them. He saw there was a gold high school ring on the victim's right hand, so he asked one of the officers to take the ring off. The officer slipped on a pair of gloves and gently removed the ring. Then he held the ring up so he and Knowles could get a better look, and in the sunlight they could read the engraving on the inside of the ring clearly. It said, "Crystal Todd." Knowles had children of his own, and so seeing this young woman whose life had been stolen from her really hit him hard. And so right there in the ditch, he leaned over Crystal's body and he quietly promised her he would find whoever had done this and he would bring them to justice. Then Knowles climbed out of the ditch and walked back towards his car. Officers would stay back at the scene to collect blood samples from the victim and from the road, and those samples would be passed on to forensics labs in the area to be tested. But Knowles knew those tests took time, and he wanted to start working right away. So he got into his car and he drove off, determined to keep the promise he had just made to that poor girl. Not long after leaving the crime scene, Knowles pulled up in front of Crystal's house, and he saw Crystal's mom pacing back and forth and smoking on the large wooden porch. He could tell she had not slept all night. Knowles dreaded this part of the job more than anything, but he wanted to make sure Crystal's mom learned about her daughter from him before everybody else in town heard the news. So Knowles took a deep breath, he stepped out of his car, and he approached her. He was tall and in his 30s, with a kind face and a warm demeanor, and when Crystal's mom saw him, she smiled, thinking he might have good news for her. But when Knowles reached her, he put his hands on her shoulders, and a grave look came across his face. And Crystal's mom knew her daughter was gone, and she started crying. In a gentle voice, Knowles told her that they had found Crystal's body, and he said how sorry he was for her loss. Then he made the same promise to her that he'd made to her daughter. He would find the person who had done this. Knowles said he hated to put her through anything else that morning, but he asked her if she could tell him anything about the night before that might help him figure out what had happened to her daughter. Crystal's mom could barely think. She was crying and her hands were trembling, and so she took a long drag on her cigarette and just tried to clear her mind for a second. Then she told Knowles that Crystal had gone to a party the night before and she hadn't come home for curfew. She said she had called around and nobody had seen or heard from Crystal, and one of her friends, Ken, had even called a couple of hospitals to see if maybe she was there, but she wasn't. And then after that, Crystal's mom just said she couldn't remember anything and she went back to smoking. Knowles told Crystal's mother again how sorry he was, and then he turned and walked back to his car. Crystal's mom watched him drive away from the house, and then she went back inside and collapsed on the couch, sobbing. Then she reached over and grabbed the phone and called Ken. On the other line, when Ken heard the news, he was totally devastated. With his voice cracking, he said he would come by as soon as possible. He would be with her so that Crystal's mom would not be alone. Not long after Knowles left Crystal's house, he got word that Crystal's car had been located. It was found in the middle school parking lot. So Knowles headed in that direction. When he arrived, he met several other officers in that parking lot, and he hoped Crystal's car could offer some clues as to what happened. The thing that struck Knowles immediately about the car was that there was no sign of a break-in or a struggle, and Crystal's purse was still in the passenger seat. To Knowles, that indicated that Crystal had parked there under her own free will, and that her murder had likely not been the result of a robbery. Knowles hoped that Crystal's friends might be able to shed some light on how Crystal had gotten from her car in the middle school parking lot to the road where her body had been found. And he knew on Sunday evenings, almost all of the teenagers in town got together to hang out in the mall parking lot. So later that day, as the sun started to set over the woods, Knowles headed to the mall. By the time he got there, news of Crystal's murder had spread all through town, and the local teenagers had gathered together at the mall, just like Knowles figured they would. But instead of making plans or talking about school, the teenagers were discussing what had happened to their friend Crystal. Knowles parked his car, stepped outside, and walked towards a group of kids who were leaning against a car nearby. He introduced himself and asked if any of them had known Crystal. He was not surprised that basically all of them said they either knew her well or had at least spent some time with her in school. Then Knowles asked if any of them had been to the party where Crystal was the night before, or if they had heard anything about what had happened the night before. One of the young women nearby chimed in and said that she heard that Crystal had been murdered as part of a satanic ritual. Knowles sighed and shook his head. The last thing he needed was some crazy rumor about Satanists spreading through town. But then another girl said she was at the party the night before and that Crystal had hoped to meet a guy there. Knowles asked who this guy was, but none of the kids seemed to know. Then the girl said there was another guy who might have gone looking for Crystal the night before. She said his name was Davy and that Crystal had broken up with him after a few dates and he was really angry about it. And all of the other kids in the group agreed. Davy was someone Knowles should talk to. So Knowles got all of the information he could about Davy from this group of teenagers, then he told them all to be careful, and he headed back to his car. The kids had told Knowles that Davy lived in a nearby town, and back at the station, Knowles got an address. And Knowles had connections in the police force in the neighboring town, so he contacted them and told them what was happening. They said they would round up Davy for him and that Knowles could question him at their police station. And so later that night, Knowles drove out of Conway towards this nearby town, and he was already starting to form a picture of what he thought could have happened based on the crime scene and how he had found Crystal's car. Knowles believed Crystal had parked her car at the middle school by choice and then gotten into another car with someone she knew, and he thought there was a strong possibility that whoever was driving that other car was the person who had killed her. And considering the violence that had been inflicted on Crystal, Knowles thought he was most likely looking for a young man who was angry with her. And Davy, a teenage boy who Crystal had rejected, definitely fit that description. A little while later, and Knowles had finally arrived at the neighboring town's police station. When he got there, an officer from the local force greeted him and told him that Davy was ready for questioning. The officer also said when they picked Davy up, they discovered the exterior and interior of his truck had just been washed, and that the boy had been carrying a pocket knife. Then the officer led Knowles through the station into a small interrogation room where Davy was seated behind a wooden table. The room was very bright and very cold. Knowles took a seat and stared across the table at Davy. Davy was 18 years old, tall and wiry, and he couldn't stop shifting around in his chair. Knowles' expression was blank, and he didn't give away anything he was thinking. Then, in a calm voice, he asked if Davy had killed Crystal. Davy shifted more in his chair and tapped his foot on the ground. He didn't look up at Knowles, but he said he had nothing to do with any crime. He said he'd called Crystal the day before to see if she wanted to go out with him, but she had said she already had plans. Not totally buying his answer, Knowles pushed a little more and asked if Davy made a habit of washing his truck on Sunday evenings. Then, for the first time, Davy looked Knowles in the eye. He smiled at the detective and said keeping his vehicle clean was very important to him. Knowles smiled back at him, at which point Davy looked back down at the floor. Then Davy cleared his throat and said again that he had not seen Crystal the night before and he hadn't even been in Conway. Knowles leaned forward across the table and asked if anybody could back up his story, and Davy said some friends had been with him, so yes. Davy fit Knowles' idea of the potential killer, but Knowles knew he still had to gather more information before he could determine Davy's guilt or innocence. The kid had been a little smug about cleaning his truck, but a lot of young men in the area went out of their way to keep their trucks looking really good. And Knowles knew a knife was most likely the murder weapon, but Davy carrying a pocket knife on him was not out of the ordinary because it was a pretty common practice amongst hunters and hikers in the area. So Knowles told Davy not to leave town and that police would be in touch if they needed more information. Then he walked out of the interrogation room, thanked the officers at the station for helping him, and headed back outside to his car. It had only been about 12 hours since Crystal's body had been discovered, but Knowles already felt like he was running out of time. He knew that the murder of a popular high school student could send panic through a small town like Conway, so he wanted to close the case as fast as possible and reassure everyone that their families were safe. But over the next several days, Knowles questioned all of Davy's friends, and they all corroborated his story that he had not seen Crystal or been in Conway on the night of her murder. And so Knowles started to feel like his chance to close this case quickly was slipping away. A week went by with no new leads in the investigation, and now Knowles found himself standing outside in a huge crowd of people gathered in the church cemetery who were desperate for answers. Over 1,000 people were there to attend Crystal's funeral, including almost every teenager who went to school with her. Knowles could hear crying throughout the crowd as the minister said his final prayer. Knowles and members of his team had come to the funeral to see if anything or anyone might stand out and offer them any sort of clue. But as Knowles watched Crystal's friends and family walk by her coffin to say their final goodbye, all he saw was a town in mourning. Crystal's death had affected everyone, and he knew her murder would stay with this community for decades to come. By the time Knowles left, he knew the funeral hadn't given him any new information to go on. In fact, it had just made it clear how difficult his job would be. In a town like Conway, where everybody seemed to know Crystal, the list of potential suspects was almost endless. So, not long after the funeral, Knowles reached out to state law enforcement and forensics experts in South Carolina for help, and together they came up with a plan to narrow down Knowles' search. They decided they would use DNA testing. DNA testing is an investigative technique that uses biological evidence found at the crime scene or on a victim to connect a suspect to the crime or to rule out a potential suspect. At the time of Crystal's death, DNA testing was still a relatively new technique, and it hadn't been used yet to solve a murder case in the state of South Carolina. But Knowles wanted to use all of the tools available to him. So the police in Conway made a public announcement that they needed male volunteers to submit samples for DNA testing. Police said these samples would help them eliminate suspects and enable them to narrow down their search for Crystal's killer. Knowles hoped at least a few of Crystal's male classmates who'd been at the party with her would volunteer, but he was astonished when over 50 men in the community quickly agreed to provide DNA samples in the hope it would help the investigation. The DNA testing would be handled by the state, and Knowles was informed it could take months before they had all of the results. He was happy his team had taken another step in the investigation, but he wasn't about to just wait around for test results that might not even lead to the killer. So while he waited for the results, Knowles kept digging into Crystal's personal life. And in January of 1992, so about a month and a half after Crystal's funeral, Knowles discovered something that he thought was a major break in the case. On a cool January night, Knowles sat at his desk in the station reading through Crystal's school notebooks that had been retrieved from her locker. Knowles was exhausted because he and his team had been working around the clock on this case for months, but he refused to let that exhaustion get in the way of the promise he had made to Crystal and her mother. Knowles rubbed his eyes, picked up the mug on his desk, took a sip of coffee, and kept reading over the notebooks. He was looking for anything that might help his investigation, but as he read, he just started to feel a deep sense of sadness. Amidst Crystal's notes for her high school classes, he saw drawings she had doodled in the margins and little messages she'd written to herself. Flipping through the notebooks, all Knowles could think about was how young Crystal was and how full of hope she must have been. But then someone had robbed her of all of that, and that person was still walking free. Just then, something in one of the notebooks jumped out at Knowles. The name Andy Tyndall was written in the flowery handwriting of a teenager who might have a crush. So Knowles flipped through a few more pages, and he saw Andy's name again written in the same way. In the interviews that Knowles had conducted with Crystal's friends, Andy's name had never come up. But now Knowles wondered if Andy was the high school boy Crystal had hoped to see at the party. So during the following week, Knowles dug into Andy's background, but he discovered Andy wasn't a high school boy at all. He was a 31-year-old man who liked hanging out with high school girls. And Knowles also learned that Andy had come to Conway, South Carolina after committing a robbery in Alabama and violating his parole. And so for the first time in weeks, Knowles felt like he might have a real prime suspect. Knowles contacted some of Crystal's friends he'd already spoken to, and he asked them if they knew anything about Andy. And finally, he found one of Crystal's friends who was willing to talk. Knowles met with this girl at her house, and she told him that Andy was like a secret between some of the girls at school. She said he was handsome, charming, and he had muscles like a bodybuilder. She said she didn't know if Crystal and Andy had ever gone out, but Crystal had definitely met him, and she wouldn't have been surprised if Crystal did have a crush on him. That was the connection between Crystal and Andy that Knowles was looking for, and the fact that Andy had violated parole in another state was enough for police to bring him in. And so on January 21st, 1992, over 2 months after Crystal's murder, Knowles sat across from Andy in a small police interrogation room. But unlike Davey, the nervous teenage boy Knowles had questioned earlier in the investigation, Andy was totally calm and collected. Knowles stared at Andy across the table and asked him if he had killed Crystal. Andy didn't flinch. He just said he'd only met the girl one time, months before the murder, and had never seen her again. Knowles, who almost always kept his cool, started to get frustrated. He took a deep breath and he asked Andy why a 31-year-old man was hanging out with high school girls. But Andy said he had just talked to some of the high school girls when they'd ended up at the same events in town. Nothing more than that. Then Knowles took another breath and just stared at Andy, trying to get a read on him. Knowles wasn't sure if Andy was guilty, but his name was in Crystal's notebook and he was a known criminal, and Knowles didn't want to just let him walk. So Knowles leaned forward in his chair and asked if Andy would be willing to submit samples for DNA testing. Andy stared back at Knowles for a bit, and then, in the same calm voice he'd had throughout the entire interview, he said he would do it. Andy's DNA samples would be added to the other DNA samples that state authorities were already testing from the volunteers around town. And in early February of 1992, almost 3 months after Crystal's murder, Knowles would finally see the results from those DNA tests. And Knowles' theory that the killer was a man who felt Crystal had wronged him in some way would be proven true. And Knowles would rediscover a detail from his investigation that would solidify the killer's motive. Based on DNA test results, evidence collected at the murder scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Crystal Todd in the early morning hours of November 17, 1991. At about 11:15 p.m. on November 16th, Crystal's killer cruised down the tree-lined road that cut right through Conway in his blue Plymouth Sundance car. He passed by the mall and glanced out the window to see if anyone was hanging out, but the parking lot was empty, so he kept on driving. It was getting late, but he really wanted to find a girl to spend some time with. Then he looked up the road ahead of him and saw a car coming to a stop at a red light. He looked closer and saw the vanity license plates that said C. Todd, and he started laughing. He knew that was Crystal's car, and if he could have picked one girl in town to be with right now, it would have been her. So the killer pulled up right next to Crystal's car and began honking. She didn't respond, so he leaned on his horn even harder, and this time it worked, and Crystal looked over at him and she smiled, he smiled back, and he felt his heart beat a little bit faster. Then he rolled down his window and she did the same, and then he asked her if she wanted to hang out and she said yes, and then the light turned green and he followed her into the middle school parking lot. The killer watched as Crystal walked past his car and climbed into his passenger seat. Once she was in the car, he started driving, and they began talking about the party she had just gone to. As Crystal spoke, the killer began looking out the window, searching for the perfect spot away from all the lights in the center of town. And when those lights were far behind him in the rearview mirror, and the road was so dark they could barely see the woods on either side, he pulled off the road and parked. Crystal asked him what he was doing, and he told her that it would be easier for them to talk if they weren't driving. His heart started beating faster, and he was breathing heavily. He looked at Crystal and smiled. Then he took off his seatbelt, he leaned over the passenger seat and tried to kiss her. Crystal told him this is not what she wanted, but he didn't listen. Crystal tried to push him off of her and get out of the car, but she couldn't. She was trapped. Then the killer forced himself on Crystal and sexually assaulted her. Sometime after midnight, when Crystal had finally gotten free, she grabbed her shirt and jeans from the floorboard, she got out of the car, began getting dressed, and then she began screaming at the killer through the open passenger door. Inside the car, the killer seethed, and his head started pounding, and he just wanted her to stop screaming, but she wouldn't stop. So the killer opened the glove compartment and grabbed a knife with a locking blade that he kept in his car. Then he opened his door and he rushed around the car towards Crystal, who was still getting dressed. Before Crystal could react, he grabbed her shoulder and slammed the knife into her skull. Crystal felt the right half of her body go completely numb. Then the killer pulled the knife out and Crystal staggered forward in the road. The killer followed with his knife raised, and Crystal held up her left hand to try to stop him, but there was nothing she could do. He stabbed her in the chest and she fell down, but the killer kept going. The killer would stab Crystal 31 times, and some of the wounds were inflicted after she was clearly already dead. Finally, the killer stopped, looked at what he'd done, and started to panic. The road was dark, but in the moonlight, he could see where the road dropped into a ditch on the opposite side from where he had parked. So he grabbed Crystal under the arms, dragged her body across the road, and threw her in the ditch. Then he ran back to his car, slammed the door, and sped off down the road. And he didn't stop until he parked in front of his house. Before he got out, he looked over the car to see if there was anything Crystal had left behind, and he saw her keys on the floorboard of the passenger seat. He grabbed her keys, got out of the car, and ran across the porch to the front door. His hand was shaking, and his house key rattled the doorknob as he unlocked the door. Once he was inside, he ran to his room, and he hid Crystal's keys in a drawer. And when he looked down at his hands, he finally realized he was covered in blood. So he stripped down, ran to the bathroom, and took a shower. Afterwards, his hands were still trembling, but he was breathing a little easier. So he walked back to his bedroom and got dressed for bed. But before he could lie down, the phone rang. He figured it was his girlfriend calling to say goodnight, so he grabbed the phone. But when he answered, it was not his girlfriend, it was Crystal's mother, who was frantic because her daughter had not come home. Ken Register, who was one of Crystal's best friends since childhood, who was a pallbearer at Crystal's funeral, and who was the person who had comforted Crystal's mother after she found out her daughter had been killed, had been the one who murdered Crystal. It would turn out that Ken fit the description of the killer Knowles had first imagined, a young man who knew Crystal and who believed he had some reason to be angry with her. But the detail from early interviews that Knowles had rediscovered, the one that would clarify Ken's motive, was that Crystal and Ken had briefly dated years before the murder, and Crystal had broken up with him because she thought they were better off as friends. But Ken didn't see it that way, and he believed Crystal belonged to him. And his desire to have her for himself, no matter the cost, had grown over the years. And then, on the night of the murder, Ken was driving home from the go-kart track when he saw Crystal at the red light, and he decided that was the night they were going to be together. And when Crystal tried to push him off of her in the car, he flew into a violent rage. It would turn out Crystal's murder was the first murder case in South Carolina solved by using DNA evidence, because Ken had been one of the people in town who had quickly provided a DNA sample when police asked for volunteers, and Ken's DNA sample had linked him to the sexual assault and the murder. Ken would later suggest he had provided those samples despite being guilty because he didn't fully understand how DNA evidence could tie him to the crime. Ken would ultimately confess to the murder, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Then, in 2022, over 30 years after the murder, Ken came up for parole. But Crystal's friends, who still missed her dearly, started a petition to have Ken's parole denied. And Ken eventually just waived his right to a parole hearing, and as of May 2023, he remains in prison. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on YouTube. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. At 10:30 p.m. on June 2, 2000, 15-year-old Heather Robinson heard her family's landline telephone ring, and so she picked it up. But before she could even say hello, she heard her father saying hello to whoever had called them. He had picked up the other telephone upstairs in his room. Heather was about to hang up, but she got curious when she heard the tense tone of the person her father was speaking to. And so she decided to just mute her handset and secretly listen to her dad's conversation. What she would hear over the next 45 seconds would not only change her life forever, but it would make headlines all over the world. This story includes sexual content and some graphic violence. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please remove the pressure plate from underneath the 5-star review button's Enter key on their keyboard. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. For 19-year-old Lisa Stassi, the Christmas of 1984 was the worst she could remember. And that was really saying something, because even though Lisa was still very young, she had been through a lot. Born in the city of Huntsville, Alabama, whose 143,000 residents lived in the northernmost part of the state, best known as the Heart of Dixie, Lisa's father had died when she was just a child, and her brother would commit suicide. And so, after dropping out of high school at the age of 17, the beautiful teenager with the bright smile decided to leave Huntsville, her broken family, and her sad memories behind, and head for the metropolitan glamour and polish of Kansas City, Kansas, 670 miles to the northwest. But 2 years after that great escape, here she was, in the middle of a cold Midwest winter, in the middle of a collapsed marriage that had lasted only 1 year. In many ways, Lisa was worse off now than she'd been back in Alabama. She had no money, she had no job skills, and she had no home. But the one thing Lisa did have that made her happier than anything else in her life was her tiny 4-month-old daughter, Tiffany. Back when Lisa had arrived in Kansas City in 1983 and met her future husband, Carl, at a bar, she hadn't intended to get pregnant. But shortly after being introduced to the handsome 23-year-old sailor, the two of them had fallen in love, and the rest, as Lisa's mother would say, was history. Just 1 month after the young couple got married in August of 1984, little Tiffany Lynn was born on September 4th at a hospital on the Missouri side of Kansas City. But right after that, things started going downhill. By October, Carl was out of the Navy and out of work, and according to Lisa's friends and family, their marriage had turned violent. 2 months later, just a few days after Christmas, Carl would leave Lisa and Tiffany, and he would rejoin the military. With nowhere to go, Lisa and her baby moved into Hope House, which was a local shelter for homeless women. But just 1 month after that horrible Christmas, Lisa got the break she had been praying for. In the beginning of January 1985, the director of Hope House told Lisa that a local philanthropist had contacted the shelter saying that his newly founded charitable organization called Kansas City Outreach had heard about Lisa's plight and wanted to help her. Kansas City Outreach looked specifically for mothers with infants who needed housing and job training, and so Lisa was a perfect fit. Through their program, Lisa would be given her own furnished apartment and an $800 monthly allowance, along with some babysitting money. Lisa was thrilled. A few days after learning about this program and agreeing to be a part of it, Lisa had packed up all of her belongings and she had driven to her sister-in-law's house, where someone from the program was going to come and pick Lisa and her baby up and take them to their new apartment. As Lisa waited, she felt annoyed that her sister-in-law, Kathy, was not as excited about this opportunity as she was. In fact, Kathy was acting like this whole thing seemed kind of sketchy, that the Kansas City Outreach program was just too good to be true. And as a heavy snowstorm moved into the area that day, Kathy suggested in a hopeful voice that maybe the weather would keep her ride from being able to drive out to pick her up that day, and that maybe Lisa would have another day or two to decide if she really wanted to go through with this. But Lisa shrugged her off, and a little while later, right at the appointed hour, the two women heard a knock on the front door. And when they opened it, to their surprise, the founder of the Kansas City Outreach program was there. He was a smiling, well-dressed, middle-aged man in a long trench coat. And after introducing himself, he walked back to the car and stood there ready to open the car door for Lisa. Lisa carefully wrapped her baby, Tiffany, in her warmest blanket and tucked her into the car seat that was sitting near the front door. Then Lisa said goodbye to her sister-in-law, and then she picked up the car seat and shielded Tiffany from the snow as she walked quickly down the front steps and out to the waiting car. She strapped her infant into the back seat, then Lisa slid into the front passenger seat where she buckled up and then waved and smiled at Kathy as the car pulled away from the curb. Over the next several weeks, Lisa, who normally spoke with her mother all the time, stopped calling. Concerned, Lisa's mother contacted the Kansas City police, and the police asked her if, besides phone calls, had she had any other interactions with her daughter recently, and Lisa's mother would hesitate, but would say yes, she had. Not long after Lisa's calls had stopped, Lisa's mother had received a typewritten note from Lisa that had her daughter's signature written out at the bottom that claimed Lisa was doing just fine and that she didn't need anything, but there was just something odd about the way the note was written. It just didn't sound like Lisa at all. 8 years later, in 1993, a 48-year-old woman named Beverly Bonner stood looking around the prison library at the Western Missouri Correctional Center in Cameron, a little town of 8,500 residents located in the northwest corner of Missouri. When Beverly had gotten her advanced degrees in teaching and librarianship back in college, she had never expected to find herself in charge of a prison library, especially after spending more than a decade as an executive with the Mobil Oil Company back in the 1970s and 80s in Kansas City. But a lot had changed for Beverly over the last 20 years. She'd had 2 children and had gone through 1 divorce before marrying her current husband, who happened to be the prison doctor at the Western Missouri Correctional Center. Beverly was grateful that she'd been hired as the prison librarian, but as she looked around at the perfectly organized collection of books on the shelves, she wished that her job was a little more challenging and that her marriage to Dr. William, now in its 6th year, was a little bit more exciting. Except that recently, very recently, Beverly's life had gotten a little bit more interesting. As she heard the metal door into the library open, Beverly felt her pulse quicken. She knew it was her new library assistant, a prison inmate whose exemplary behavior and high level of education had qualified him for this plum assignment inside the library. And when she'd first been introduced to him several weeks ago, it turned out that, amazingly, she'd actually met him before, back in 1970, when he also had worked at Mobil Oil in Kansas City as a systems analyst. Back then, there had been some gossip surrounding the circumstances under which he had been fired from Mobil, but even in the short period of time that she'd spent with him there at the library, it had become clear to Beverly that whatever had happened at Mobil, just like the fraud charges that had landed him here in prison, could not have been his fault. As he walked toward her now, eyes twinkling and that boyish grin on his face, Beverly felt her face flush as his eyes traveled up and down her body. Then, when he reached her, he leaned in close and he told her how very, very good she looked. Beverly's affair with her library assistant had begun almost immediately after he had started working with her, and by the time his prison sentence was over 6 months later, Beverly's lover had promised her an exciting role in the new business he planned to build as soon as he was on the outside. Not only would this new business make both of them rich, but Beverly believed this would finally be a career that challenged her. And it came with lots of international travel, so Beverly was really excited. And so in 1994, a few months after her lover's release, Beverly divorced her second husband, Dr. William, and got a property settlement from him for $18,000. Then she sent her kids off to live with Dr. Bonner, and then she left Missouri and headed off to Olathe, Kansas, to join her prison lover and start this new and exotic life with him. But when Beverly's oldest child died a little over 1 year later in December of 1995, Beverly didn't show up for his funeral. In fact, it had been more than 12 months since anyone had seen Beverly in person. The only communication anyone in her family had had with her since she left for Olathe, Kansas, were a few typewritten letters she had sent that had her signature at the bottom. But no matter how many times the family read these letters to reassure themselves that everything was okay with Beverly, they couldn't help but think that the language she had chosen to use in these letters sounded totally weird. It just did not sound like her. 6 years later, on a cold night in late January 2000, 28-year-old Suzette Troughton was sitting inside her apartment in Monroe, Michigan, a town of 22,000 people located in the southeast corner of the Great Lakes state. She was doing what she did almost every night, talking on the phone with her mom, Carolyn, who also lived in Monroe. While they talked, Suzette petted Pika and Harry, the 2 tiny Pekingese dogs that were her constant companions. Outside her apartment window were the familiar streets of her hometown, the place where she had been born and where her parents had gone through a nasty divorce and where she had dropped out of high school in her junior year. But despite all that, Suzette actually liked living in Monroe. And overall, she liked her job as a nurse's aide, where she mostly took care of elderly and terminally ill patients. She was actually so good at her job that she wanted to get her degree in nursing, but money was tight. Just to pay for the few nursing prep courses she was taking right now, she had to pick up a part-time waitressing job at Bob's Big Boy restaurant. So, when Suzette had found this amazing job offer online 5 months ago in the fall of 1999, she could hardly believe her luck. A well-to-do businessman in Kansas City was looking for a healthcare worker to come with him and his elderly father on a round-the-world cruise on his yacht. In exchange for taking care of his dad, the man was offering to pay all living expenses plus an annual salary of $65,000, 3 times what Suzette made working her 2 jobs in Monroe. But ever since she had accepted this job offer, her mother and some of Suzette's closest friends had voiced real concerns, saying that the opportunity just seemed way too good to be true. And sure enough, on that cold night in January of 2000, that's what Suzette's mom was talking to her about on the phone. And per usual, Suzette told her mom to stop worrying. Suzette knew her future employer was totally legit. The previous October, she'd contacted him to get more details about the job, and he'd paid for her to fly down to Kansas City for a week just to meet him and discuss the job. He'd sent a limousine to pick her up at the airport, and he'd put her up in a nice motel for 5 days. He also showed her the mansion where he lived, and he showed her a furnished apartment in a section of Kansas City called Overlook Park, where she could live when they weren't off visiting Hawaii, the Far East, and Europe. And once it was time for Suzette to move from Monroe to Kansas City on February 11th, 2000, her employer had said he would be renting a small truck for her to drive so she could bring her 2 dogs and some of her belongings along with her. Because no matter how sweet the offer was, Suzette had stressed that she could never go anywhere without her Pika and Harry. A few minutes later, the phone conversation with her mother wrapped up, and Suzette said goodnight and that she would call again tomorrow. After hanging up the phone, Suzette turned to the computer in her small living room. A minute later, she was logged in to her favorite website, where she spent the majority of her free time. The name of this website was the International Council of Masters, and it was fully and completely devoted to people like Suzette who were deep into the world and alternate lifestyle of BDSM. BDSM is an umbrella term that refers to a spectrum of sexual behaviors and preferences that can be divvied up into the groups of bondage and discipline, domination and submission, and sadism and masochism. Suzette was very close with her mother, and always had been, but this aspect of her life was something she kept secret. Suzette had multiple online BDSM relationships, and during the last several years, she had moved from the world of BDSM sex online to BDSM sex in person. And in a strange twist of fate, it was actually through BDSM that she had met her future employer, the wealthy Kansas City businessman. This man, whose online username was the Slave Master, had first reached out to Suzette in one of her BDSM chat rooms, and it was there that he actually offered her the $65,000 a year sail around the world on a yacht dream job. And so Suzette had obviously been very interested and asked him for more information, and in response, he had paid for her to come to Kansas to learn more. During those 5 days, Suzette spent a little time learning about the dream job and a lot of time being the slave master's slave. She had even signed his so-called slave contract, which said he had full control over her and could punish her however and whenever he wanted. For 5 days, the slave master filmed himself having his way with Suzette. And when Suzette had come back to Monroe, she would spend hours re-watching those videos, fantasizing about doing it all over again when she headed off to begin working for him. Finally, February 11th rolled around, and it was time for Suzette to leave Monroe and head off to Kansas City. Suzette kissed her mom and other family members goodbye. She tucked Pika and Harry into their deluxe travel cases, and then she climbed into the truck that the slave master had rented for her, and then she began the 750-mile drive west to Kansas City. A few weeks later, on March 1st, from her motel room in Kansas City, Suzette sent a message on her computer to a fellow BDSM enthusiast to say that she and the slave master were finally leaving for their around-the-world yacht trip with her master's elderly father, and that she was really excited and that this experience was going to be a lot of fun. At 10:30 that morning, the slave master opened the door of Suzette's motel room and walked inside. He looked around, happy to see that Suzette had packed up the last of her things and was ready to go. But before they left, there was just one more thing he needed Suzette to do. He walked across the room and put the blank pieces of paper he had been holding down on a table, and then he gestured for Suzette to come over. He told her to sign her name at the bottom of each page. This way, he said, she'd be reminded to write some letters to her family once they were out at sea. He said he could even help her type some of the letters up since he'd be bringing along his typewriter. Suzette, who was a terrible speller and who preferred messaging on the computer over letter writing, thought this was a good idea. And after she'd signed her name to each page, she turned her attention to making sure that her dogs had finished their food and that they were snuggled down inside of their carrying case. A few minutes later, Suzette was in the car with the slave master on their way to pick up his father. But as they drove, the slave master suddenly turned to her and said, "Before we get my dad, I want to take you somewhere." He told her he wanted to show her a piece of farm property that he owned in Lynn County, which was just outside of Kansas City. Suzette grinned and said, "Okay," thinking her master must want one more sexual encounter before they set sail. And sure enough, after they had arrived at the single trailer on a deserted stretch of flat farmland 60 miles south of Olathe, the slave master parked the car, reached into the glove compartment, and pulled out a blindfold and a length of rope. Suzette smiled. She could tell by the expression on his face that he clearly had something very special planned for her. A few hours later, the slave master was back in his car, except this time he was alone, minus Suzette's 2 dogs who were whining in the back seat. The slave master wiped some sweat from his brow, then he fired up the car engine, pulled out of the dirt lot onto the road. A few weeks later, Suzette's mother, Carolyn, would receive a typewritten letter in the mail from her daughter. And in this letter, her daughter would tell her how great the cruise was going so far. And at the bottom of the letter was her daughter's signature. But just like Lisa Stassi's family and Beverly Bonner's family, Carolyn and the rest of Suzette's family thought this letter just didn't seem right. It didn't sound like Suzette. But what made Suzette's family especially skeptical of this letter was that one of her dog's names had been badly misspelled. Not just a typo, but a full-blown misspelling. Suzette adored her dogs like they were her children, and she would never have spelled the dog's name that way. And so the combination of this egregious spelling error combined with the overall alien feel of the letter convinced Suzette's family that Suzette simply could not have been the letter's author. But the implications of this were not clear. Did this mean Suzette was in trouble? Was this letter just a prank? They didn't know. But they had no way of actually getting in touch with Suzette because she was out on this yacht, so there was no phone number for her. So with nothing else to do, the family just kind of began digging into Suzette's life to see if there was anything they could find. And her family quickly discovered that Suzette was a part of this BDSM community, but more importantly, they discovered that the Kansas City businessman who had offered Suzette this dream job was also a member of the BDSM community, and his username was the Slave Master. And when the family began reaching out to people in this community that had heard of the Slave Master, no one had nice things to say about him. And so at this discovery, Suzette's mother, Carolyn, just got this really bad feeling that something had happened to her daughter. And so she called the Kansas City police. And on this call, she would tell them that, she can't get in touch with her daughter, and she's gotten these letters from her daughter, but it doesn't sound like her. And then at the end of her initial story of what's going on with her daughter, she would tell the police that the last person she believed her daughter was with was her new employer, a man who called himself the Slave Master online. Now, at first, the police, as they're listening to Carolyn, they were a little bit dismissive of her story because it sounded like her adult daughter had chosen to go do something and she was sending letters, so she was in touch. So what was the big deal? But when they heard Carolyn mention the Slave Master part of the story, everything changed because the police knew exactly who the Slave Master was. A few months later, in the spring of 2000, 15-year-old Heather Robinson was sitting in her bedroom in her family's house in Chicago, Illinois, listening to her parents arguing downstairs. As she tossed her long brown hair over her shoulders, Heather was thinking to herself, did her parents really believe that she couldn't hear them fighting? And did they really think that over the last year she hadn't noticed that arguments like this one were becoming more and more frequent? It actually wasn't even the arguing that bothered Heather the most. It was the fact that her parents tried to act like these fights weren't even happening, like everything was just fine. And this totally annoyed and stressed Heather out. But the truth was, at the age of 15, everything bothered Heather, including the fact that she was an only child, and she didn't have any siblings to talk with about her parents going through this rough patch, and about how way overprotective her parents were. They had rules for everything, like not allowing her to take phone calls after 9 p.m., or telling her it was time to get off the family computer when she was mid-conversation with her friends. And with her 16th birthday and driver's license coming up that fall, she was sure they'd be making up even more rules for her. As she sat there wishing she had a little more independence, Heather suddenly remembered that offer her uncle had made her almost a year earlier. It was back when one of his 4 kids was getting married, and Heather and her parents, Donald and Frida Robinson, had flown down to Florida for her cousin's wedding. And after the wedding, during the big reception, Heather's uncle had pulled her out onto the dance floor. Heather didn't know her uncle very well. He and his wife lived 6 hours away from them, and her uncle was 10 years older than her own father, so the 2 brothers hadn't really grown up together. And except for special occasions like this wedding, they really only got together once a year at an annual family reunion. Now, as Heather recalled that actual dance with her uncle, she shuddered. Her uncle, who had been drinking at the reception, had suddenly gotten way too close to her, kind of rubbing up against her. However, just as quickly as he had started doing that, he had stopped, and then taking hold of one of her arms and said, it looks like things are kind of rough right now with your parents, and if you ever need to get away, you can just message me and I'll buy you a plane ticket and you can come out and visit me, no questions asked, just a little getaway. Then he squeezed her arm one more time, he gave her a nod, and then he walked away. At the time, Heather had not been remotely interested in this offer. But now, as she sat there staring out at the dark, cold night, listening to her mom and dad argue downstairs, she started to think maybe she should go visit her uncle. Maybe some time away would be a good thing. A few weeks later, at 10:30 p.m. on Friday, June 2nd, Heather listened from her bedroom for the sound of her parents retreating to their room. Once she was sure they were both in there, Heather quietly slipped out of her bedroom and headed downstairs to be closer to the landline telephone. She was expecting a call from a friend, but since it was after 9 p.m., she was not allowed to take calls. And so her plan was just to stand right in front of the phone and grab it the second it rang so it didn't wake up her parents, who had a phone right next to their bed. But when the phone actually rang just a few minutes later, Heather was fast, but not fast enough. By the time she'd picked up the receiver and put it to her ear, she could hear her father's sleepy voice already saying, "Hello?" Immediately, Heather pressed mute on her own handset, but instead of hanging up the phone, Heather hesitated. She could hear on the phone not her friend who was supposed to be calling, but one of her relatives, and his voice was low and very tense. Intrigued, Heather put the phone back to her ear and secretly listened. What Heather would hear in the next 45 seconds would change her life forever and make headlines all over the world. A few months earlier, when Suzette's mother, Carolyn, had called the Kansas City police and told them about how her daughter might be in trouble and that the last person she thought she had been with was this slave master person, the police instantly knew the man she was talking about because they were already investigating him. Several women in the BDSM community had come forward with complaints against this man. Most of the women had said they had met up with the slave master in person and he had assaulted them or stolen from them. So the police were confident that this slave master guy was a really bad guy. And so when Carolyn said her daughter, Suzette, had been with him last, and now no one could get in touch with Suzette and didn't know where she was, this sent up huge red flags for the police. But what pushed their suspicions over the edge was when, a couple of days later, Carolyn got a call from Olathe, Kansas Animal Control saying they had just found her daughter's beloved Pekingese dogs alive but abandoned in a trailer park. Carolyn knew her daughter would never abandon those dogs willingly, and so she called the Kansas City police back to tell them. When the police heard about the dogs, not only that Suzette was not with them, which was highly unusual according to her mother, but that the dogs were found in the same trailer park where they knew the slave master lived, they knew this could not be a coincidence. And so, on the morning of Friday, June 2nd, just 12 hours before 15-year-old Heather Robinson overheard that fateful phone conversation, the police in Kansas descended on the trailer park where the slave master lived. Federal, state, and local law enforcement would search not only the slave master's house, but also his 17-acre piece of farmland 60 miles to the south and several storage units he had rented in Raymore, Missouri, 30 miles to the west. In his house, investigators would quickly find Suzette's ID cards, as well as some blank stationery with her signatures written out at the bottom. They also found a receipt from 1985 for a motel room rented in Kansas City to a 19-year-old woman named Lisa Stassi. But these discoveries were nothing compared to what was found next. On the slave master's farmland were 3 85-gallon oil drums hidden next to the single shabby trailer. Inside of these drums, investigators found the bodies of 2 women who had died of puncture wounds to their skull, likely caused by a hammer. One of the bodies belonged to a 21-year-old Polish immigrant from Indiana who had been one of the slave master's slaves. The other was 28-year-old Suzette Troughton. She was found wearing a blindfold and had a piece of rope tied around her neck. Out at the slave master's storage facility in Raymore, Missouri, investigators found that one of the units had been rented back in 1994 under the name of former prison librarian Beverly Bonner. Inside that unit, they found 3 storage containers. One of them had Beverly Bonner's body inside of it, and the others held 2 more victims the slave master had recruited for sex, a 45-year-old mother and her 15-year-old disabled daughter who had been confined to a wheelchair. That night, at around 10:30 p.m., just hours before the public would find out the identity of the slave master, 15-year-old Heather Robinson picked up the phone and heard her father give a sleepy hello to whoever had called. Heather quickly muted her handset, but decided to secretly listen to her father's conversation. The low, tense voice of the person on the other line belonged to the son-in-law of her father's older brother, John Robinson. John was the uncle that Heather had danced with just a few months earlier at the wedding, who had been somewhat inappropriate with her and then kind of abruptly offered to fly her out to visit with him anytime she wanted. In a hushed and terrified voice, the son-in-law delivered the news that would start appearing in the newspapers and on the TV the next day. John had just been arrested for murder. Heather was so shocked by what she had just heard that she didn't really hear anything else the son-in-law said. However, before the son-in-law hung up, Heather remembered him saying that John was connected to several women, one of which was a woman named Lisa Stassi. Heather eventually hung up the phone, and then she took a deep breath, and she walked up the stairs and then walked down the hallway to her parents' bedroom, and when she pushed open the door, she saw her normally stoic father sobbing into his hands. Next to him, her mother was staring straight ahead with a shocked and frozen look on her ashen face. Heather had 2 questions. Is it really true that Uncle John killed someone? And who is Lisa Stassi? It would turn out Heather's uncle, John Robinson, was the slave master, which meant Heather's uncle was a serial killer. But this revelation was not the most shocking thing that Heather would learn that night. The most shocking thing had to do with Lisa Stassi. 15 years earlier, back in January of 1985, Heather's uncle, John, was the man who had driven through the snowstorm to pick up 19-year-old Lisa Stassi and her baby to take them to their new apartment that his program was going to pay for. But instead of bringing her to this new apartment, John brought Lisa and her baby to the Roadway Inn Motel in Overlook Park, Kansas City, and once there, he somehow convinced Lisa, like he would do with all of his other victims, to sign a blank piece of stationery. This would allow him to write letters to the victims' families as if they were letters written by the victim, because their signature was at the bottom. He hoped this tactic would keep the police off of his back. After Lisa had signed these papers, John killed her. As for Lisa's baby, John simply executed his plan. For years, John's brother, Donald, and his wife, Frida, who were Heather's parents, had been trying to adopt a child, but they had been unsuccessful. And so during this very stressful time, John had told them that in the course of his work as a philanthropist, he would sometimes get leads on babies who were up for adoption, and if he ever found a baby in need of a home, he would let them know. And now that John had just killed Lisa, her baby suddenly needed a home. So he called his brother and gave him the good news. And Donald, feeling incredibly lucky and grateful and believing the whole process had been totally legal, happily agreed to take this baby, and he agreed to pay John the $5,500 for the adoption paperwork. This paperwork was of course forged by John. And after that, Donald and his wife rushed to Kansas City where they met their beautiful little 4-month-old baby girl. They would name her Heather. Before returning with baby Heather to her new home in Chicago, John insisted that they all pose for a family picture. In this picture, which would hang in Heather's house for the next 15 years, Uncle John is seen sitting in the front row bouncing on his knee his new 4-month-old niece, whose mother he had literally just murdered. A few days after being told the horrific truth about who she was, DNA and fingerprints would confirm it was all true. Heather really was Lisa Stassi's daughter. But tragically, even though John would confess to murdering Lisa, he would refuse to disclose how he actually killed her or where he dumped her remains. In the story that investigators would piece together, John Robinson was a con man, and in 1985, his cons became deadly. That year, he created the fake charity he called the Kansas City Outreach Program that claimed to help young mothers and their infants get back on their feet, but in reality, John had just created this phony charity to lure a young mother to him so he could kill her and profit off of her baby. This is exactly what he did to Lisa. After handing Lisa's baby, Heather, over to his brother, Donald, John then convinced Donald to pay him the $5,500 for the forged adoption paperwork. Investigators don't know for sure if John killed any more victims after Lisa up until the early 1990s, but he is a strong suspect in at least 2 missing women cases from that time frame. In 1994, John would land in jail in Missouri for fraud, and while in jail, he would meet and seduce Beverly Bonner. Once he got out of jail, he convinced Beverly to divorce her husband and come out to Kansas City to be with him, and when she did this, he killed her and collected that $18,000 settlement check she received from her divorce. After killing Beverly, John discovered the internet. Specifically, he discovered how easy it was to lure people to him using the BDSM community that lived on the internet. And so he remade himself as the slave master online and began brutalizing and killing people at a much more rapid pace. Police believe it was around this point when he became the slave master that John's motives for killing people shifted from killing for monetary gain to killing simply because he wanted to. This is likely the reason why Suzette was murdered. She was simply available. In total, John was found to be responsible for 8 murders, but in theory, it could be more. But John, who is actually still alive awaiting execution, is totally unwilling to give any information up. So there is a very good chance he will take his secrets to the grave. Heather Robinson would ultimately choose to be legally adopted by her parents, Donald and Frida. They truly had no idea what John had done and were, by all accounts, excellent parents to Heather. In 2019, at the age of 35, on the 2020 crime documentary Sole Survivor, Heather broke her long silence about her childhood ordeal. In that interview, Heather said that if she had accepted that offer John had made her back in 2000 at the wedding reception when he said he would buy her a plane ticket to come out to Kansas to spend some alone time with him, she believes he would have killed her and stuffed her in one of those 85-gallon oil drums. Heather, who is now married and a mother herself, said she is committed to finding her own biological mother's remains and returning them to the memorial to Lisa Stassi that now stands empty in the State Line Cemetery in Madison County, Alabama. The headstone there currently reads, Lisa Stassi, a rose in God's garden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please remove the pressure plate from underneath the 5-star review button's enter key on their keyboard. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.